Hello, everyone. Thank you ever so much for joining us for the Descendants Association Black History Month Salon series and our second session, The History of Jesuit Enslavement, Part 1. We are still awaiting the arrival of some additional attendees, but we want to welcome our speakers as well as those of you who are already here. So our first session of the day will be with Adam Rothman, the professor of history and director of Georgetown University's Center for the Study of Slavery, after which we will have a brief 5-minute break and then hear from Sharon M. Leon of the Jesuit Plantation Project. And then after our final break of the day, we will hear from Kevin Porter, our GU 272 Descendants Association's Reparative Research Coordinator and Community Liaison. You will have the option of participating in a Q&A session with each and every one of our speakers for today. In the meantime, we would appreciate it if you could keep your cameras and microphones off until the Q&A sessions begin. That way we can avoid any distractions. All right. So without further ado, we are going to begin with our first session of the day with Adam Rothman momentarily. So once again, thank you ever so much. And we also want you to know, if you want to know more about our speakers for today, you can utilize the agenda that we sent to you, which contains their biographies, as well as the lecture topics and descriptions. So thank you ever so much. And we will now begin with Dr. Adam Rothman. Thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Shannon. Can everybody hear me? Great. Shannon, I wonder if you would allow me to share my screen for
Absolutely.
a presentation. Thank you. Great. Wonderful. Okay, so hello, everyone. My name is Adam Rothman. I'm a professor of history at Georgetown University. I've been the curator of a website called the Georgetown Slavery Archive, a digital repository of historical information connected to Georgetown, the Jesuits, and enslavement. And I am currently the director of Georgetown's Center for the Study of Slavery and its Legacies. And I'm just so pleased to be here with you today. I want to thank Shannon and Rochelle and the GU 272 Descendants Association for this opportunity to be with you, to gather together, and to allow me to share some of the things that have been going on at Georgetown well over, over the last 10 years, if not longer. It's great to see some old friends on this Zoom, and also wonderful to see so many people gathered here today. So I'm staring at a lot of names on the screen right now. If you are in a position to turn your camera on so we can see each other's faces, it's wonderful. It's always nice to speak to people I can see rather than just to names on a screen. But if you're not comfortable doing that, then that's perfectly fine as well. I just like to be able to see, who's here, and it is wonderful to see. Wow, so many of you again. What I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes. And I'm going to talk, first of all, about Georgetown's historical connections to enslavement. And then I'm going to talk about some of the things that have taken place more recently, really over the last 10 years, to recover the memory of that history, and to engage in acts of reconciliation around that history, because I think that's been very meaningful for many people on this Zoom, but also for those of us here at Georgetown. I want to say, just as a preface, that I've been teaching at Georgetown for 25 years now, which is hard to believe. I'm a historian of slavery, abolition, and emancipation. That's my specialty. And I teach classes on that subject. And I've been teaching classes on that subject at Georgetown, since I arrived here. But about 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago now, I had the opportunity to serve on Georgetown's working group on slavery, memory, and reconciliation. And that was a group of faculty, staff, students, and alumni charged by the then president of the university, Jack DeGioia, with exploring our school's historical connections to slavery and coming up with a series of recommendations to the university about how we should respond to that. And I have to say that that experience changed my life. It changed my experience at Georgetown. It changed what I teach, how I teach it, and my whole relationship to students and the Georgetown community. And certainly one of the best things for me to come out of that experience was the opportunity to meet so many members of the GU 272 Descendant community, like Rochelle Prater and many others, who have taught me so much about not just the history of the GU 272 and their descendants, but also about the meaning of history itself. So that's one reason why I'm so grateful to be part of this gathering. I see Henrietta Pike on the Zoom as well. Henrietta, you're another one who's taught me so much. The opportunity to collaborate with members of the GU 272 Descendant community, for instance, in my classes, to introduce some of you to students at Georgetown has been really one of the joys of my career and my life. So I just wanted to say that to start. So let's get into it. I'm going to share my screen. I have some images to show you here. So let's do this. Can everybody see my my screen? It should say Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation at Georgetown. Okay. Just nod if you can see it. Okay, great, wonderful. All right. So I want to start by saying, that Georgetown has a long history of historical connection to enslavement. And although there's been an intense engagement around this history for the last 10 years, it was never a secret. And it was never deliberately hidden away and suppressed. And just to give you an example of that, this is a man named Pedro Arrupe, who was the head of the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, at a pivotal moment in the 1960s and 1970s. It is Arrupe who really reoriented the Society of Jesus towards questions of social justice in a whole variety of ways. And we now have our newest dormitory at Georgetown is actually named after Father Arrupe. Well, in 1967, Arrupe issued a letter to the Jesuits called the Interracial Apostolate, talking about the Jesuit response to the crisis of racism in the United States in the 1960s. And in that letter from 1967, he said this. He said, "It is chastening to recall that before the Civil War, some American Jesuit houses owned Negro slaves." And quite a bit of his letter used that as a kind of touchstone for the way the Jesuits should respond to that history in the 1960s. So this was the 1960s, and Arrupe knew, and he reminded the Jesuits of their history. So this knowledge actually goes back a long way. It wasn't, newly discovered in 2015. Jesuit historians have been writing about it from the early 20th century. My predecessors at Georgetown had actually engaged in research and curriculum development around Georgetown's historical connections to slavery. And in fact, your next speaker today, Sharon Leon, was heavily involved in those efforts when she was a student at Georgetown back in the day. And then, of course, there are members of the GU 272 descendant community who had some knowledge of this in their own family histories and lore. So I think it's important to understand that this history has been there all along. And so one question is why we are all activated and organized around it today, when we weren't for such a long time. So I think that's worth thinking about. So what exactly is the history of Georgetown's connections to enslavement? So I want to go through a couple of the important ways that my own university is connected to the history of slavery. And here is an image, an illustration of Georgetown College from the 1830s. It looks a lot different than it does today. But I would say that Georgetown was connected to slavery in two distinct ways. In the first place, well, there are many ways, but there's kind of two buckets that I'll put it in. And the first bucket is that this campus, the campus you're looking at in this illustration, the site of the school, was itself a site of enslavement. Now, Georgetown was founded by the Catholic slaveholding elite of Maryland and the Chesapeake, led by a man named John Carroll, the first Catholic bishop of the United States. And that Catholic slaveholding elite stamped Georgetown in its own image. And one of the elements of that image was slaveholding. So we have records of enslaved people working at the college from almost the moment that its doors opened in the early 1790s, all the way through emancipation in Washington, D.C. in 1862. The first was a woman named Suki, who's in the ledgers of the college in 1792. She worked at the college in the 1790s. And the last is a man named Aaron Edmondson, who worked at the college up until March of 1862, 1 month before the abolition of slavery in Washington, D.C. So we have 80 years of evidence of Georgetown as a site of enslavement. And I just want to share with you one of the most powerful sources and stories from that history of slave owning, of the college as a site of slave owning. This is a difficult one to look at, I think. This is actually the first source I show to all of my students at Georgetown who are in any of my classes that connect to this history. This is an advertisement for an enslaved man named Isaac, who worked at the college in 1814 and who ran away trying to seek his freedom. His name was Isaac. He's described in this advertisement as being 23 years old, quite black complexion, about 5 feet 8 inches high. It has a long description of what he was wearing when he fled. And then it says that he has learned to read tolerably well, and it is likely that he may have procured a written pass. It is supposed that he has gone to Pennsylvania. He was raised at Mrs. Johnson's near Bryantown, Charles County. And it goes on to list the reward. The author of this advertisement was a man named John McElroy, who was a Jesuit priest who was the clerk of Georgetown College. So this is evidence of a lot of things. It's evidence of the presence of enslaved people on Georgetown's campus. It tells us something about Isaac's own life And it also tells us ultimately about his aspirations for freedom. And it also tells us that the Jesuits who ran Georgetown thought of him, at least in part, as a piece of property, and they wanted him back. Now, there are thousands of these runaway ads in American newspapers across the 19th century, hundreds of thousands of them. This is only one. In most of these cases, in most of the advertisements, we really don't know what happened next. We don't know the rest of the story. But in Isaac's case, we have a little bit more information. And that information helps us to give us an idea of the kinds of historical sources and information that are out there to understand slavery at the college. So John McElroy kept a journal of daily life at the college. It's a remarkable source. But in that journal, he records this event that Isaac ran away from the college. This is the end of January 1814. So almost to the day that we're speaking. And McElroy's journal also reveals that Isaac was arrested, he was caught and arrested in Baltimore and subsequently sold. And at that point, we lose track of what happened to him. This Isaac, there are other Isaacs, but this Isaac falls out of the historical record so far as we know. So it's a tragic story, but one that I think is indicative of the nature of enslavement at Georgetown. So I wanted to share that story with you because it gives this something of a human face. I want to add that this source and many other sources from Georgetown's archives, from the archives of the Maryland Jesuits, have been digitized and are available on the Georgetown Slavery Archive website, slaveryarchive.georgetown.edu. So you can explore these sources for yourselves, our students can explore them, and other researchers can explore them as well. One thing about the archives is that we have, I would say, hundreds of documents amid thousands of pages in the records of Georgetown and the Jesuit archives connected to the history of slavery. It's a vast archive, and it's actually it's incredibly rich and an important tool for understanding not just the history of the GU 272 or Georgetown, but the whole history of American slavery. So it's very important. But in all of the archives, in these hundreds, even thousands of pages of written material, there's actually only one document that was written by an enslaved person, which tells you something about the imbalance of power in the making of the historical record itself. And that one document is the letter you're looking at now. This is a letter from a man named Thomas Brown, who was enslaved at St. Louis University. He had been in Maryland and had been transported out to St. Louis with the Maryland Jesuits who founded the Jesuit mission in Missouri and St. Louis University. And so this is a very, very important document. And it's especially important because of what it says. This letter is a petition from Thomas Brown to the Maryland Jesuits to allow him to purchase his freedom and the freedom of his wife. And I'll just read you just a bit of it. He says, "I have been a faithful servant in the society going on 38 years, and my wife Molly has been born and raised in the society. She is now about 52 years of age. Now we have not a place to lay our heads in our old age after all our service." And he requested that he be allowed to purchase his freedom and the freedom of his wife for $50. So this is another document from our archives that testifies to the aspirations for freedom of enslaved people connected to Georgetown and the Maryland Jesuits. So I want to say that the slavery archive that we've compiled is also a freedom archive. It's also an archive of the aspirations for freedom. Now, Thomas Brown and his wife came from the Maryland plantations owned by the Jesuits, and that is the second major way that the school was connected to the history of slavery. So what you're looking at now is a census that the Jesuits took of the enslaved people who lived on a series of plantations across Maryland that they owned. This census was taken in preparation for the infamous sale of 1838, when the Maryland Jesuits sold more than 272 people to two planters in Louisiana. So I'll say more about that sale in a minute. And many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with the details of this sale. But just to back up a little bit, the Jesuits arrived in Maryland in 1634, and wherever the Jesuits went, they had to support themselves, and they usually supported themselves by getting involved in the local economy. And in Maryland, the local economy was tobacco production. By the middle of the 18th century, that is to say the middle of the 1700s, the Jesuits owned several tobacco plantations across Maryland. And like other tobacco planters, they had also made a transition to the use of enslaved labor on those plantations, so that by around 1750, the Maryland Jesuits were some of the biggest landowners and slave owners in the colony of Maryland. And in fact, the Maryland Jesuits were at the northern tip of a vast Jesuit slaveholding complex that extended all the way down to Brazil. And across the Americas, the Society of Jesus owned somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 people. So this is a Pan-American and transatlantic complex. And what we're talking about with Maryland is only the northern tip of that. The original business model for Georgetown, founded in the 1780s, was that the profits from those plantations would go to subsidize the education of free white boys and men at Georgetown. So there was an organic connection between slavery on the plantations and the college itself. But by the early 19th century, that business model was breaking down because the plantations, for various reasons, were just not making very much money, and the Jesuits were falling into debt. So the Jesuits start a 20-year conversation about what to do, a 20-year debate about what to do about their human property. And they conclude that debate in the 1830s with the fateful decision to sell almost the entire community of people they owned and to invest the proceeds in other activities of the Jesuit order, the schools, the missions, and the churches. So in 1838, the Maryland Jesuits who ran Georgetown University sold these folks down the river. They sold them to two planters in Louisiana, Jesse Beatty and Henry Johnson, in Iberville in Ascension Parish, Louisiana. They sold them for $115,000 to be paid over a period of 10 years. And they took the first down payment of that sale and they used it to pay off the burdensome debts of Georgetown College. So I might not be sitting here today talking to you as a historian of slavery at Georgetown University if it were not for the history of slavery at Georgetown University. So that existential connection is one of the reasons why I feel such an obligation to tell this story to students at Georgetown, to other members of the community, to share what we know with members of the Descendant community, and to learn more about your own family histories. Because most of the members of the GU 272 who were sold ended up in central Louisiana at places like West Oak Plantation in Iberville Parish. And this is a photograph that I took of the site of West Oak Plantation today. where at least I'm sure some of your families of folks on this call may be from and are certainly familiar with. So let me just make one final point about the history of slavery at Georgetown, and that is that that history did not end in 1838. As I said earlier, enslaved people continued to work on campus, and in fact at those plantations out in Maryland, all through emancipation, whenever emancipation took place. And Georgetown itself was really indelibly stamped by this history and its legacies. And you can see that in our various school colors, the blue and the gray, which come from the warring sides of the Civil War. Our school colors were adopted in the 1870s by the rowing team to signal reconciliation between the white Northern and Southern students at the university. And so to this very day, that Confederate gray is part of our school's identity. A lot of students are shocked when I tell them this. They have no idea that that is where the colors come from. And when I tell them this, they have to think more deeply about the contemporary legacies of our history. So I could say a lot more about all of this, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have uh, when I get through the rest of the presentation. But one thing I just want to conclude with on the history side of things is to say that, a lot of what we know about Georgetown's history of slavery comes from the written archival record, much of which is in our own archives in the Booth Family Center at Special Collections. And the Booth Family Center for Special Collections is open to guests and visitors. So if you want to see these documents for yourselves and not just online, you can come to Georgetown and see these materials. And quite a few members of the GU 272 descendant community have done that. And I think it is a powerful experience. But I also want to say that there's more to history than what's in the written record. There's more to history that's than is in the archives. And that's one of the reasons why the various oral history projects that have been conducted with members of the descendant community are so important, because those oral histories tell us things you can't find in the archives. But they tell us things that are very important about this history as well. So let me quickly move to issues of memory and reconciliation. And here I want to just put what's going on at Georgetown in something of a broader context, because Georgetown is not the only university that's been investigating its historical connections to slavery. And it's really part of a broader movement that began with Brown University almost 2 decades ago and has spread to dozens of colleges, not just in the United States, but elsewhere. It's also part of new scholarship into the historical connections between slavery and American universities. And I think a real pioneer here was a historian named Craig Stephen Wilder at MIT, who wrote the book Ebony and Ivy, which came out in 2014 about the Ivy League's connections to slavery. Schools like Virginia and Harvard and even Glasgow have undertaken projects to explore their own histories of slavery. So again, Georgetown is not alone. Georgetown is also not the only Catholic and Jesuit university to explore its own historical connections to slavery. We have done so. St. Louis University has done so to an extent. And most recently, Loyola University of Maryland has also done a really deep dive into its own history in collaboration, I would add, with some members of the enslaved community, of descendants of the enslaved community from Maryland. So this is an ongoing thing, and it's not just Georgetown. But Georgetown is, of course, has been at the center of this for a lot of reasons, and one reason is because of the emergence of the GU 272 descendant community. Helped along by the Georgetown Memory Project back in 2015, 2016, the New York Times journalist Rachel Swarns, who wrote this very powerful article in the New York Times in April of 2016, bringing the story of the GU 272 descendant community to a national audience. And since then, quite a lot has happened at Georgetown that I just want to either remind you of or tell you about if you haven't heard it before. So we are changing the landscape of historical memory at the university. What you're looking at here is Isaac Hawkins Hall. This building used to be known as Milady Hall. Thomas Milady was the chief Jesuit architect of the 1838 sale of the GU 272. So this building has been renamed after Isaac Hawkins, who was one of the members of the GU 272. He was the eldest patriarch of one of the largest families in the GU 272, the Hawkins family. And I know there are some Hawkins descendants with us today, so I salute you. And he is also the first person listed on both the Articles of Agreement in 1838 between Thomas Milady and the purchasers in Louisiana, and that census that I showed you a few slides ago. So he is a very prominent figure in the GU 272, and he's come to kind of symbolize the whole GU 272 community in this landscape of memory. But there are places on campus that remain unmarked that are connected to the history of slavery, for example, the college ground. So there's a church just outside of Georgetown's campus called Holy Trinity, probably the oldest Catholic church in Washington, D.C. And for a while in the 1830s, the cemetery of Holy Trinity Church was located on the site of what is today Georgetown's campus. That cemetery eventually fell into neglect and disuse. Holy Trinity started to use another cemetery in DC, and over time it was abandoned. And in the 1950s, Georgetown built a science building on the site of that old cemetery, moving some of the remains that were discovered there to another cemetery across DC. So this is actually right next to the newest dormitory that I mentioned, Arupe Hall, and there's a beautiful kind of walkway, pedestrian path that goes between the science building and Arupe Hall. But most people at Georgetown don't know as they walk along that path that they're walking on top of an old, abandoned cemetery, and that cemetery included enslaved people and free people of color who were members of the Holy Trinity Church, including enslaved people who were actually owned by the Jesuits and worked at the college. And we know this from the burial records that we have in our archives. So this is just one example of work that we still have to do at Georgetown to acknowledge the way that the history of slavery is connected to the physical environment of our campus. In addition to that, we have taken steps to engage in research and teaching and creative projects around our history. I mentioned the Georgetown Slavery Archive, for example. That's been an important one. Another important one that many of you may already know about is the work of Melisande, GU 272 descendant Melisande Short Coulomb, who, in collaboration with folks at Georgetown in our Laboratory for Global Politics and Performance, has created a one-woman show called Here I Am about her family history. This was performed at Georgetown. It's been performed at Loyola. It's actually being performed this coming week at Georgetown's campus in Qatar in the Middle East. So Melisande is going global. And I just want to add that we have recently started a new class at Georgetown called Race, Power, and Justice at Georgetown, which is now required of all incoming first year and transfer undergraduates. So this is a required class, and everybody's taking it. And a week of this class is dedicated to Georgetown's history of slavery and the Slavery Memory and Reconciliation Project. So we're trying to ensure that no undergraduate student can go through Georgetown without knowing this history. And one of the things on the curriculum is a documentary about Melisande's experience at Georgetown. In terms of scholarship, there are more and more books about not just the GU 272 and Georgetown's connections to slavery, but scholarship on Catholic slaveholding. So there's a lot of scholarship coming out around this history, and I think this is one of the reasons why the history of the GU 272 and Georgetown, although it's important to all of us here for, I think, very personal reasons, it's also a much broader story because it is a microcosm of the whole history of American slavery. And you can think about all of the issues of American history through our collective story. There have been other efforts at reconciliation. The Jesuits, in combination with some descendants, have created a Truth and Reconciliation Foundation that is providing scholarships for descendants. And here at Georgetown, there is also now a reconciliation fund that is dedicated to projects that come from the descendant community and will benefit the descendant community. And I just want to highlight the Reconciliation Fund because I think it's a great example, not just of the potential for collaboration, but of the importance of Georgetown's students in pushing for a consciousness of our history and for concrete steps at reconciliation and reparation. The Reconciliation Fund comes out of a student campaign back in 2019 to establish a student activity fee that would subsidize a fund to benefit descendants. It was called the GU 272 referendum. And here you see some chalk on campus from the campaign back in 2019. The students strongly supported the establishment of that reconciliation fund. And it took a while, but the university has established that fund, and it has recently distributed its second round of grants. So, this is really a landmark effort at reconciliation. I think you'd be hard pressed to find any other university that is doing this kind of thing. And hopefully we can all work together so that it is successful and meaningful. Let me just conclude with a note from one of the icons of Georgetown's history, and that is John Thompson, our legendary head men's basketball coach. Thompson wrote a memoir. I strongly encourage it. It's really a remarkable book, about his life, his experience, his time at Georgetown. The last chapter of that book is actually dedicated to, and it's all about Georgetown's historical connections to slavery and John Thompson's own understanding of that. Thompson, who came from a Black Catholic family in Maryland, he thought, but couldn't actually prove that his own family was connected to the Maryland Jesuit enslaved community. So that's interesting. But I found that he has a line at the very end of the book connected to the history that I think is very powerful. And I try to tell everybody around the Georgetown community this. He says, "I think not forgetting makes you strong." And I believe that. And I believe that we have discovered that to be the case at Georgetown over the last 10 years, where I'll say the rediscovery of this history at Georgetown has not weakened us. It has not blemished. I don't think it has blemished the university community or its reputation, but I think it actually has made us stronger in a lot of ways. And I think the collaborations that we have been able to have as with members of the descendant community like yourselves is one of the reasons why we are stronger now than we were when we started this work. So, and for that, I thank you all. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to take questions. Shannon, I don't know if we should do questions in the chat or should you want to just call on people who have questions? What do you think is the best way?
Great question. So those individuals who have questions are more than able to raise their hands, and I will call on them if that is all right with you.
Great.
All right. So the question and answer period has begun. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we will get to you. So does anyone have any questions? So Elliot Brown has asked in the chat, is Isaac the runaway related to Isaac Hawkins?
Thank you for that question. It's a great question. The honest answer is I don't know, but I don't think so. We don't have any, we really don't know what happened to the Isaac in the Runaway ad after he was sold in 1814, whether he somehow made his way back to Georgetown, whether he's the same Isaac as Isaac, the other Isaac Hawkins. We just don't know. And that lack of knowing kind of haunts me. There's so much that we have a lot of information. We know a lot about a lot of people, but there's still limits to what we know. And it's just a haunting problem. So I don't know.
All right. Thank you for that. Delbra Brown has raised her hand and has a question. Delbra?
Hi, thank you. So my question is basically, you guys have documented the slaves who their former owner were, because not all of them were owned by the Jesuits. They were hired by them, hired per se. But when they were sold, being able to have the reference of who they were sold to is greatly important so that those of us can try to track our lineage. I know that you have records of them having been sold, but the documentation, do you have that as well as who they were sold to?
Yeah. So thank you for that question. For the sale in 1838, we have for the most part, not for everyone, but for the most part, we do know who they were sold to. We have a number of bills of sale that identify which members of the GU 272 enslaved community were sold to Henry Johnson and who was sold to Jesse Beatty. And I think the part of the reasons why the genealogical research has been so fruitful is because of those particular documents and the ability to track members from Maryland to Louisiana. There are complications because not everybody in the original bills of sale ended up in Louisiana. Some were sold to folks here in Maryland, largely because they were married to people who were owned by other folks here in Maryland. And those folks have been harder to track because the records are not as available. But the Georgetown Memory Project has been able to track some of the folks who stayed behind in Maryland. And then for the folks who ended up in Louisiana, there are subsequent sales as well. And although there's a lot of documentation about that, so both West Oak Plantation and Chatham Plantation change hands over time, and there's a very good paper trail for the people on those plantations, but there may have been individual sales that are harder to track, and people kind of fall out of the historical record. But there are quite a lot of examples where we know who people were sold to, and that does make it easier to trace. Deborah, do you have a follow-up?
I did. So what about pre-1838 sale? So when we're speaking of 1800s, 1790s, you mentioned Suki and how that she was sent to the college to work. What happened to her? Did she die there? Was she a hire that went there? Was she actually owned? Those types of things are what I was wondering.
Yeah, no, great question. Those been a lot harder to track and identify with Suki. Like, we know who her owner was, but we don't know what happened to her after, I think it's 1796, which is the last year that she appears in the Georgetown records. And part of the problem is actually the records for Washington, D.C. are very fragmentary. They're very scattered. And in some ways, the records for Louisiana are much better than the records for D.C. and Maryland. I'll give you another example. We know that at the same time as there was a sale of at the same time as the sale of the GU-272 took place in 1838, there was another sale by the college to a man named John Hoover. And but we don't have the names of the people who were sold to Hoover. We don't know what happened to them. So those are some of the ongoing research projects. We know quite a lot about the GU-272, the folks who were on the plantations out in Maryland, and we don't know as much about the enslaved people who were on Georgetown's campus. So that's something we're trying to explore further. Right now, we've got a project going on using the 1862 compensation petitions from Washington, D.C., which are really a rich record of enslavement in the district, to see if we can find any of the folks connected to Georgetown in those records. But it's a process. It's very painstaking.
Thank you.
All right, and thank you, Deborah, for your question. There are two additional questions in the chat. One refers to whether or not there is additional information about Isaac Hawkins available. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, there is some additional information. He appears in some of the other sources that are available on the Georgetown Slavery Archive website. But I'll say this. So we know something about, if I remember correctly, who his parents were. And of course, off the top of my head, I cannot remember now. But we have some information about his family tree going back. We also know that Isaac Hawkins himself did not end up in Louisiana. He remained behind in Maryland and died in Maryland. So his family was essentially sold out from under him. He remained behind.
Oh. Yes, and I see that Robin Prouty has her hand up.
Hello, good morning. Thank you. As we know, before the 1838 sale, 6 couples in 1823, and then, it's 3 couples, 6 people, and the letter you mentioned, Thomas Brown, he was one of those who were forced to go to St. Louis University, in the first Jesuit novitiate. My question is there any research, because we do have Isaac and the Suki Queen, where did they come from, or who were there? Well, I work with my cousin Kevin, and he's given us a lot of historical connections. Like my great-great-grandfather, 5-time removed Proteus, is Phyllis's son, and part of that freedom suit. Queen Freedom Suit. So my question is there any research, or are you making the connection to prior to them coming to Missouri? How can we go back and research that history to find out everything? That's my question, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and it's a wonderful question. And your question also points to how big this history is, how many different dimensions it has, like how many connections there are. And it's hard to keep track of it all. There are different people working on different pieces of it. And there are historians who are working on the folks who end up in Missouri and their origins, and there's been some published work on that. But I actually want to ask Sharon Leon. I'm going to put Sharon on the spot, because Sharon also, I think Sharon has done more work than almost anybody on the whole scope of the Maryland Jesuit enslaved community over time, and may have some insight about the records for the era before 1838.
Yeah, well, so thank you, Adam. And it is, what I will say is it is a huge work in progress. But one of the things that I've tried to do, which we'll talk more about later, is to note every instance of a mention of an enslaved person in the archival sources, and then to try to reconstruct some of those families. And so we have some of that, and I'll be able to show you some of that. But I've identified, and this is a shifting number, about 1,200 people across the time period from sort of 1717 to the sale date, and many of them are connected. But But what I would say is that I'm still filling in all of those connections. And I want to invite you all to help me with that, as I know that you guys are working from one direction and we're working from another direction, and that I think that we can. Kelly Schmidt, who you'll hear from next week, the folks at St. Louis are working from other directions. As Adam suggests, there's like lots of this going on in lots of different directions. There are so many Isaacs. There are so many Isaacs that sometimes it's a little bit difficult to tell that you've got the right Isaac married to the right person, and that can be difficult. But my stuff is all public, and I'm happy to help people try and navigate through that. And we'll take a look at that in a few minutes.
All right. Thank you ever so much for that. We are down to our last 15 minutes for this particular Q&A session. So we have a question from Patricia Bayon Johnson. Patricia, you are still muted.
Yes, I had problems unmuting. It's more of a comment than question. Rachel did expose world Jesuit enslavement. However, my family has known since 2004 that we were enslaved by the Jesuits. In her article about haunting, I can't remember the title, but it's the one that was on published on Sunday, April 17, 2016, where she gives all the credit to Richard Salini, who found my blog about the Jesuit enslaved people. And she sort of minimized what I did and what my group did. She put it in parentheses. This is Bayon Johnson for her connection. Early effort by the university to publish record online about Jesuit enslavement. When you put something in parentheses, that means that it is not as important as, you know, the rest of the article. It's just I'm like a side comment, you know, we weren't that important. And, you know, it's not that I need strokes or that recognition. It's just that she ignored my 8 people who helped me with this project. And so I just want to bring that to the table to give my team, the Butler team, who found, I think, more than 1,500 of these. And just put it out there that, hey, and that she also called me about 6 times. We had a conversation about 6 times before she wrote this article. I just want to let the attendees know there's more to the story than is published.
Patricia, can I just say that if I appreciate that, and I apologize because in my own presentation this morning, like today, I didn't mention you and your work, which was really the foundation of the genealogical research that came out after 2016. And so I apologize for not doing that myself. I I always try to give you credit for the work that you and the Butler group did, and I should have done that today, so I apologize for not doing that. But you certainly have been an inspiration to me, and I appreciate you.
Okay, my comments really weren't directed at you, Adam. It was definitely directed to Rachel Swarns, who, as I said, I had at least six conversations with her before she. And I think there's some animosity which caused her to do what she did. I'm just saying that we are more than a bunch of words that's included in parentheses. You know, that's not important when you do that. And I just want everybody to know what happened.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, thank you for that. And Patricia, you are an inspiration to us all. I now see that Rochelle has raised her hand.
Yes, good morning, everybody. And actually, Cousin Patricia, your comment is actually what I have to say to Adam. Adam, one thing in my interaction, I want everybody on the call to note that I think your communication and your interaction with the descendant community has been one of respect for our history. Um, I shared that with Shannon as we prepared for the speaker. Sharon, I haven't gotten to meet you, but I looked at your website first, and I love that your approach was not to focus on the slaveholders, but the enslaved. So I want the family members to know they in for a treat, because she gave a real deep dive into what the lives were like and who the actual enslaved people. And so many times, even among our family members, our descendant community, we tend to talk about our relatives, our loved ones, as a simple label of enslaved. I know when I found this history out, Adam, when I went on the campus, when they did the renaming of the building, I happened to be in that courtyard when the physical plant was making the change. And I literally almost passed out, and Adam was there to catch me and hold me while I cried. I'm still emotional about that today. Because we have to understand as we journey, especially in this climate today, right? We have to understand that it's not, we all are in this together. And for us to survive and come out okay on the other side, we have to recognize and celebrate our allies in this history. I see a Jesuit on the call. Sean, I'm going to call you out because Sean has been incredible, a quiet presence. You guys may not know him. I didn't really know him. I knew him by name first because he was one of the first people to join us when we had the membership model back in the day, as a non-descendant. And I've been to a number of things and he's been there. So I see cousin Robin on the call, right? She's from a different descendant group. There are descendant groups from Grand Coteau, Louisiana that got there before us. And I want to say, as a great, great, great granddaughter of Isaac Hawkins, I am so excited and so humbled to be a catalyst to bring our family together once again. And so I just want to thank everybody on the call. Adam, I had one question for you before Shannon pull a plug on me. Can you I need to understand the Sauterly plantation and its connection to this history because I connect to a number of Sauterly descendants. And I don't really know the story behind it. If you can tell it to me briefly, that would be wonderful. If not, we can talk offline. Either or would be perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rochelle. And thank you for your sentiments as well as the question. Sauterly, for those who don't know, is a a major historic landmark, old tobacco plantation in southern Maryland. I think it's in St. Mary's County. Michelle, you can correct me if I'm wrong. So I don't know all the connections between Sotterley and some of the Jesuit sites, but I do know that there is a marriage connection between one of the owners of Sotterley and I think it's Henry Johnson. Oh no, it's Philip Barton Key, who ended up, I believe, owning Chatham Plantation for a while. So there's that connection, and there may be other connections among the enslaved there as well. The folks who have been working on St. Mary's, African American genealogical history have charted out a lot of that. So we'll have to see from them, work with them to see if there are connections. So we can talk about that offline. But one thing I just want to say about Sotterley, which I think will be of interest to most of you, is that Sotterley was actually the first kind of historic plantation museum to work closely with members of a enslaved descendant community to enrich their interpretation of the site. The name of the woman escapes me at the moment. I'm getting a little bit older and my memory isn't working quite as sharply as it used to. It'll come to me, but there was a woman who was part of the descendant community connected to Sotterley, who back in the 80s, the 1980s, started to work with the historical interpretation, the interpreters of that site, and it was a process, but eventually, they completely redid their historical interpretation of Sotterley based on her research and her knowledge of her family history. And when you go through the museum or the interpretive sites at Sotterley, you hear her voice. Agnes Kane Callum, I think that was her name, Agnes Kane Callum. You hear her voice and the voices of other descendants telling you, what happened there. So it's a wonderful and pioneering model of descendant collaboration, engagement, and knowledge.
All right, wonderful. I did see that there was one question in the chat from Brenda Browder. She asks, what were the names of the 3 original Jesuit plantations in Maryland and their owners that you referred to?
The Jesuit plantations in Maryland were St. Inigo's. I'll go through this. There, St. Inigo's, Newtown, St. Thomas Manor, White Marsh. Those are the 4, I think. Then there was also the Bohemia Plantation, which changed hands a couple of times. But the Jesuits actually owned those plantations, if I remember correctly, pretty much from the beginning and all the way through. And the Corporation of Roman Catholic Clergymen, which is the civil corporation that ended up owning the Jesuit property, actually still owns much of that property to this very day. A lot of them look kind of, they look kind of different. So most of St. Inigo's is now a Patuxent naval base, leased to the government. So they've been through a lot of different iterations. But those are the plantations. Did I miss anybody? Did I miss any, Sharon?
So I would say, depending on where you are in the records, you might also hear about Port Tobacco, which is near St. Thomas, and St. Joseph's, which for a time was sort of an offshoot.
That's right.
And then got sold. And so, depending on sort of what decade you're in, there may be more or fewer.
St. Joseph's is on the Eastern Shore.
Yeah.
I think, and those are the core. And for the 1838 sale, the GU 272 enslaved community came from St. Inigo's, St. Thomas, Newtown, and White Marsh.
Okay, thank you for that. There is one more question. We are at our last minute of this particular session. So, Ms. Bowen,
Hi, Shannon. Thank you. Question: did the Jesuits or any of the archdiocese have access or control over the sisters, the nuns who owned slaves, like import tobacco?
I don't know about Port Tobacco. I know the order I know most about is the Sisters of the Visitation, who had a monastery right next to Georgetown College and have a school to this very day, the Visitation School, very well respected school. And from my understanding, there's a lot of connections between the nuns at Visitation and the Jesuits at Georgetown, just proximity and other things. But nobody controlled them, as far as I know. They were their own entity and did their own thing, although they were certainly in close connection with the Jesuit leadership.
I'd say, like, technically they fall under the jurisdiction of their local archbishop, but actual exercise of that control, not really.
And before we conclude, I just want to say that if anybody has further questions or just wants to get in touch with me, or wants to collaborate in some way, just please feel free to reach out to me. You can email me directly at ar44@georgetown.edu. That's probably the easiest way to reach me. Lots of folks on this call know how to reach me, so please, my door is open to everybody.
thank you so much, Adam, for your fantastic presentation. We are now on break until 12:10. We will regroup then and hear from Sharon Leon. Once again, thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
All right, and we are back. It's time for a session with Sharon Leon of the Jesuit Plantation Project. The floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Shannon, and certainly also to Rochelle for the nice things that she said already about my work, and to Adam for his tremendous collaboration over the years. Adam and I have known each other for a while now, and it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure to work with him on a number of projects. Let me start my timer here so that I don't spend too much time blathering on for you. So there are a number of things I want to talk about today. Mostly I want to share the work that I have been doing now, probably for just about for the last 10 years. I actually came back to the history of the people enslaved by the Maryland Province Jesuits just about the same time that everyone else in the country learned about this history. And Adam's point earlier that so many of you have been working on this research and work for so long and is so deeply important to you, but also that I am sort of case study number one that this history was not was well known to Georgetown alumni in cycles over the years. So I'm going to share my slides with you today, both by sharing my screen, but also I put a link in the chat to my slides, which live on the web, so that you can follow along if you'd like while I'm speaking, and also so that you can explore them further. And I will also add a link to the space on the web where my in progress research and writing lives. And when I say in progress, I really do mean in progress. Please don't hold the editing against me. But let me share my screen here and we'll begin. All right. Okay, let's see if I can get this out of the way. Can everyone see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Great, wonderful. So I want to talk today about the project that I have come to call the Jesuit Plantation Project in shorthand. The reason I call it the Jesuit Plantation Project is it is actually a second generation of a project that I worked on as an undergraduate, which some of you might be familiar with. It lived on the web from 1995 till somewhere along the way when it disappeared. But my goal in doing this work is that I wanted to try to figure out as much as we could about the lives of the enslaved people who were owned by the community of priests who started Georgetown. So between 1717 and the sale in 1838. So some of you might be familiar with this very old website that has gone through several iterations. I was among the class of Georgetown undergraduates in American Studies who worked on this originally. And like many of you, and like much of this history, our work was initially mostly centered on trying to trace out what we could from that census that Adam showed you earlier today. Of course, my work has been improved and gone hand in hand with work of Adam and his students on the Slavery Archive at Georgetown. It'll take a second for this to load. But this is the current iteration of the site that I've been working on since roughly 2015. And I would say, like many of you, I have a personal connection to this history too. My father's people are from St. Mary's City, way back. So of those slave-owning white Catholics, that's my dad's side of the family. And I'm a multi-generation Georgetown alum, so I'm a legacy student as well. And so Adam's suggestion that his work as a historian at Georgetown would not have been possible without the enslaved labor of your ancestors, it is true that me sitting here as a historian today also would not have been possible without that labor. And so I've always been drawn to this story once I sort of started to make those connections, even as an undergraduate in 1995. In 2016, I did a visiting chair at Marquette and started to work again on this material. And then I got a fellowship from the NEH that I sat through 2017 and 2018. I got to sit in the Booth Family Center for the entire year, basically, and did my best to read every piece of the Maryland Province archives from beginning to end in search of what I could find out about the people enslaved by the Jesuits. And so in doing that work, I went through and I transcribed every instance that I could find across those documents of a mention of an enslaved person. So ledger books, letters, inventories, all of those sorts of things. I then took those transcriptions and turned them into spreadsheets, which I then sort of sorted out into categories of mentions of people and the events in which they participated. And so over the years, I have managed to identify at the moment, and this changes from day to day because sometimes you realize that one person who is mentioned is the same as the other person you have mentioned, then you have to combine records. But at the moment, I have 1,151 enslaved people identified who had been owned by the Jesuits, 49 people related to that community, owned by others, 36 free Blacks who were either married in or related to that community, and then 62 different priests across the history that I've experienced. And then we have sort of a large array and cast of white lay people who are also in surrounding areas and in transactions and things like that. Sometimes hiring out, those sorts of things. And so if you go to the website and you take a look at the people, you can start to see by those groups that I've mentioned, individual entries for individual people. And you can click through to individual records. And we see these individual records, what we might be able to know about some of these people. Not only what we know about possible birth events and things like that, freedom status, where the person lives, so in this case, Adeline Campbell, and where she shows up in particular historical records. So she certainly shows up in the 1838 sales inventory. So we start to see a connection of people and events across time through the site. And so you, of course, might also have heard about some of the things that Adam gestured towards, this larger history of thinking about how to account for what we can know about the experience of enslaved people who labored at colleges and universities. And so there's a related project that Adam and I are both involved in called On These Grounds that I just sort of wanted to mention. Happy to talk a little bit about that later if you'd like. It follows the same type of process that you see with my own work here. And this is a browse page from the site that gives us all the different kinds of events that I have so far been able to, individual events I've been able to post to the site. So every time someone is mentioned in an inventory, every time someone is mentioned being baptized, every time someone is mentioned having a health event, or running away, or trying to purchase their freedom, or filing a freedom petition. There are a number of types of events that are not yet on the site, and they're mostly related to labor and individual everyday labor and small transactions amongst enslaved people and non-enslaved people. But what I wanted to do today is think about the kinds of things that we can see across this material. And obviously, the first place we might start, and where many of you have started with your own research because it is so important, is to think about what we can see just simply mapping out family relationships. And so even though individuals are mentioned like this in the large census that Adam pointed to, we start to see family groups, and this has been such a rich source for genealogy and history work amongst the descendant community. We also have a set of appearances in the day-to-day transaction and log books of the archival materials that let us learn some other things about the histories of families. And so I wanted to start with someone named Perry Greenwood. Don't actually know whether Perry Greenwood is an enslaved person not owned by the Jesuits, or he is a free person. But what we do know, in 1790, he purchases a woman named Nell and her son Perry for £4. It's not very much money at that point. But what we see is we can pretty much guess, because Nell's son's name is also Perry, it turns out from other documents, that what we're watching here is Perry Greenwood going through the process of saving money and reunifying his family by purchasing his wife and his son from the Jesuits. We see a similar transaction a little bit later in the 1790s with a man named Patrick Barnes. Patrick Barnes is a blacksmith. And he puts his family's freedom into motion in 1792. So he starts paying over time for his wife, Mary, and his children, Isaac and Hannah. And it takes him a while. And once he purchases their freedom, then by 1797, he's able to purchase his own. And so we start to see how Patrick Barnes does this we can surmise that based on his role as a blacksmith, he's able to generate additional income of his own to save to purchase Mary. We get all the way down here. We start to see his family relationships. He's spouse of Mary, and his children are Hannah and Isaac. And we see the actual events for their sale. But along the way, we know lots more about Patrick. We start to know what kinds of provisions he has, what kinds of clothing he's being granted, where he's allowed to travel, and when he does his own freedom petition and owns his own manumission. So only by linking all of these little individual events together do we start to see a bigger story for these individual families and how their lives have been unfolded. And in addition, this is a kind of chart that you'd all be familiar with, a family tree. We start to see that it's pretty easy if we work really hard in a number of cases to trace families back 4 generations, from the sale generation all the way back to what I call the founding generation, who starts to show up in the 1770s and 1780s. And so this is Tony and Henrietta and their children, and then their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. And so while it's easy to see their relationships in a chart, if we start with Tony and Tony's item as an individual in the site, you can trace right on down through his children. And then if you click through, we get to the Plowdens, who you are likely to be quite familiar with. And so then we have Bibby and her spouse Nicholas and their children, and we can chase all the way down again to the 1838 inventory. So we start to see those family generations being built out in the site. This is true also of Dina and Harry, another group from Newtown. What this testifies to is that in some cases and in some locations, the information left by the Jesuits is much more rich than in other cases. And so in fact, in the records from Newtown, we have a much better sense of the family connections. And if we swing on through here, here's an item for Dina, right? And we can start to see Dina's children, many children with Harry and those kinds of relationships. But really the thing that I wanted to talk about today, and the thing that I want to sort of bring to this conversation, because I know that you're all familiar with the scholarship about the sales and about the freedom petitions and those sorts of things, I wanted to see if we could spend some time thinking about what the conditions of everyday life were for the enslaved folks who lived in southern and central Maryland. So not necessarily on the college, but out on the plantations themselves. And so I'm going to start thinking about the issue of housing. So when Joseph Mosley wrote to his sister in October 1766, he was keen to relate to her his triumph in settling a new outpost for the Jesuit mission in Maryland. In 1764, he had been dispatched by his superiors to scout and purchase a new plantation site in Talbot County. So this is St. Joseph's Manor. By March 1765, he's acquired the land for St. Joseph's, and he writes to his sister about what the building provisions in that space look like. And he says there are 3 buildings, a miserable dwelling house, and much worse for some Negroes, and a house to cure tobacco in. The dwelling house was nothing but a few boards riven of oak trees, not sawed plank, and these nailed together keep out some of the coldest air. Not one brick or stone about it, no plastering and no chimney, but a little stole and knee roof to let out the smoke. In this I lived until winter, when I got it plastered to keep out ye cold, and built a brick chimney, and ye bricks I was obliged to buy and cart about 5 miles. So this is mostly saying, accommodations are terrible. He's managed to make them better for himself. To to this newly established outpost, he brings 8 enslaved people with him from White Marsh. And none of them would enjoy the warmth of the plastered walls and the fireplace that he built in his own space. However, in their cramped quarters, the enslaved group might have found some refuge. His mention of separate buildings to house the enslaved reflect increasingly common spatial relationships amongst enslaved and their owners, and possibly indentured servants. These separate accommodations eventually included features designed to support and perpetuate reproduction amongst the enslaved, even though indentured servants were traditionally discouraged from having productive sexual relationships. We don't want the indentured servants having kids that we have to feed, but because of enslavement, encouraging family reproduction adds to the wealth of the community. So the cascading effects of this shift in the 17th century sort of result in separate quarters for the enslaved. They could also eventually be spaces of autonomy in some ways for cooking and gardening and those sorts of things. But what we know from lots of reports is that what things look like in 1765, really for the enslaved community, often they don't look much better for decades to come. When Adam Marshall takes up the position of procurator in 1820, he goes out to ascertain the conditions of the various sites. And he discovers things that, we all know, that the farms were mostly poorly managed in lots and lots of respects, especially financially. And the accounting practices were sort of all over the place. There's significant debt. He writes to his superiors in Rome in 1821, and he reports, quote, "I found our plantations, with only 2 exceptions, in very wretched conditions, very, very poorly provided with the necessaries for cultivation, their buildings insufficient and in ruins, particularly those which accommodate the slaves, which are almost universally unfit for human beings to live in." So that's however many decades later, situation hasn't changed very much. This all becomes more troubling when we realize the degree to which climate change, we think it's cold now, the situation in Maryland in this period, as far as the weather is concerned, is really quite dire. The direct climate effect that historians of weather point to at this point is something called the Little Ice Age, where the climate becomes slightly but significantly colder over time. And for residents of the Chesapeake region, this general cooling trend was exemplified over and over and over again by crippling winters in the 17th and 18th century. None of the Jesuits kept, as far as we know, kept weather data, but other people in the area did, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Charles Carroll of Carrollton. All of them made special note of a major snowstorm in 1772. Over the course of 10 days, Carroll tells us 3 significant snowstorms laid 20 inches of snow at Carrollton in Howard County. And those storms were then followed by several extremely hard winters. In 1780, the winter was marked by Chesapeake Bay being frozen with 5 to 7 inches of ice from the head to the mouth, the whole bay, right up to the Potomac River. And in 1784, Baltimore Harbor closed at the beginning of January and didn't reopen to ship traffic until March. But Thomas Jefferson gives us the best and most reliable, most consistent information about the weather, and that's what we're seeing here. Jefferson's cataloging of temperatures, when I'm showing you what he recorded in his travels in DC and Charlottesville and those sorts of things. The lowest temperature recorded for each year between 1793 and 1816, we're seeing the lowest temperature, around 14 degrees, 10, a degree and a half. We get to this period right here between 1803 and 1810, and we just see shockingly low temperatures. That 1807 low temperature of minus 33 degrees. It's cold for us now. with central heating, with insulation. Can you imagine being in a spot where there's no insulation and only fires? Given the context of this harsh climate, we got to wonder, what is the situation with clothing? And the modest allowance that the Jesuits made for clothing their bondspeople appears very stark, though their practices were in line with other slave owners of their era. Individual plantation account books offer kind of detailed portraits of the ways in which farm managers approached keeping their enslaved people clothed. The earliest record of clothing purchases for the enslaved stems from the Newtown Memorandum account book from the 1740s. There are 2 pages of transactions which list purchases of cotton or linen breeches, shirts, petticoats, frocks, coats, jackets, and vests. In 1791, Francis Beeston describes the allowance for clothing for the enslaved people who lived at Bohemia. And he says, of those people, men and working boys get 1 winter suit consisting of 1 woolen jacket and breeches or trousers at the option of the master, 1 pair of yarn stockings, 1 pair of shoes, 2 shirts, 1 pair of linen trousers for the summer. Women and working girls, 1 woolen short gown and petticoat for winter, 1 linen petticoat for summer, 2 shifts, 1 pair of shoes, 1 pair of yarn stockings every other year, and feeding, which I take to be additional repair to stockings alternately, so darning in between. The children, as necessity requires, so very vague there. NB, blankets when necessary, just the note, blankets when necessary. So Bohemia's record book also includes a systematic account of every piece of clothing distributed to each individual enslaved person between 1790 and 1796. And it details the kinds and variations of cloth and fabrics. These are typically fabrics that are selected across to clothe enslaved people across British North America. They're comprised of cotton and wool or both. They're cheap, they're durable. In Beeston's case, he purchases the cloth from a fuller rather than employing members of the enslaved community to weave the cloth. And these provision accounts coincide with these periods of deep cold that we've just talked about. As such, the notion that blankets might be not necessary also seems rather shocking. But Beeston's approach to clothing people for whom he was responsible in the 1890s continues to be the general practice for decades to come. 25 years later, in his duties at St. Inigo's, Brother Joseph Moberly, who we're going to hear a lot from, provided similar types and quantities of garments. But rather than buying fabric, he depended on the skilled labor of the enslaved to make much of the clothing. In 1823, reflecting back on his work, he says that each laborer received from the farm for summer 2 shirts, 1 pair of double-soled shoes, 1 pair of stockings, 1 pair of pantaloons, and a roundabout coat, all made on the farm from crops of wool and flax. The women received 2 shifts and 1 hammock for summer, and for winter, 1 pair of double-soled shoes, 1 pair of stockings, 1 petticoat, and 1 short gown. True to Moberly's summary, the ledger books at St. Indigo's include a record from March to April in 1818 that details the purchase of shoes for nearly 50 enslaved people. So the other thing that Moberly notes that's not in this quote, but is in the same spot in his journals, says hats and Sunday apparel they provided with their own funds. And so this notion, this nod to enslaved folks saving up their little bit of spare cash that they may have earned through their own trading gives us some sort of a glance into the ways and the world of enslaved people in taking a moment free from labor to think about themselves and to adorn themselves and those sorts of things. The other question is, of course, what's the food situation like? So let's think about 1815 for a minute. So imagine on any given day, you might find Nace Butler sitting down to a basic dinner he'd been eating for most of his entire life. After a hard day's work as a blacksmith, Butler was likely to tuck into a serving of cornbread and salt pork, and perhaps some cabbage. If the season was right, there might have been peaches available. Based on his and his family's extra labor, he might also have enjoyed the possibility of some other variety, including chicken, sweet potatoes, or oysters. But day after day, year after year, he would be faced with corn and pork provided by the farm manager. The monotony of the experience would have been recognized by almost every other enslaved person who lived in Maryland at that time. Just as was the case with provisioning clothing and housing, providing for the nutritional needs of the enslaved people elicited a response that could only be described as minimal from the Jesuits. Among slaveholders, the focus remained on providing enough calories for enslaved people to perform their labor, and not on the nutritional sufficiency nor any sense of variety. The Jesuits didn't differ from their neighbors in this respect. In the early years, while he was establishing Plantation at St. Joseph's, Moseley described the effort it took to begin to provide for his own basic needs when there was no market infrastructure. Again, in 1765, he describes, quote, looking out for provisions for myself, workmen, who I take to mean indentured servants, and Negroes, which at times could not hardly be got for love or money. I had no market to go to for bread, meat, and liquor, as you have in England, he's writing to his sister, where nothing can be wanted if you have money. Here you may have money and yet starve in spite of your teeth. But by 1766, he'd established himself with an array of livestock and a crop of grain for bread making. Moseley's tale of scarcity might have been resolved within a year, but the situation for enslaved people remained precarious for decades, not due to foodstuffs being unavailable, but rather due to the unwillingness of slave owners to provide sufficiently for their bondspeople. Narratives from people formerly enslaved in Maryland, including Charles Ball, William Greene, and Frederick Douglass, all enslaved in and around the same areas of the folks who were owned by the Jesuits, all confirm persistent hunger over and over and over again. But what was a matter of survival for enslaved people was frequently viewed as a matter of management and accounting by their owners. This was true for the Jesuits, and by 1815, Moberly, writing again, was convinced that the Jesuits needed to divest of their enslaved property. He was concerned by the persistent economic challenge of providing for such a large group of individuals. And in pleading his case to transition from enslavement to hired labor, sorry about that, Moberly makes the argument that his farms are producing 400 bushels of corn and 6,000 pounds of pork, but that he needs to support the 43 people he's responsible for, he needs 630 bushels of corn, 3,468 pounds of bacon, and 68 pounds of lard. What he is telling us is that they're barely breaking even, providing enough food for the enslaved people who are there. Moberly's dismissed at St. Inigo's in 1820. But he's reflecting back on the conditions of the farm. And what he tells us is that one peck of meal was a little heaped was always allowed each laborer per week, and half a peck to children. Old people who were past labor were allowed as much per week as a laborer. One peck per week was always found to be plenty, and some of them did not use it all. What they did not use was preserved for raising poultry. So I think there's some questions about what we trust about Moberly's reflection on his work and those sorts of things, but this seems like a very common approach to providing for enslaved people in the area at the time. What you see on the left here is a hand-drawn map of St. Inigo's that Moberly includes in his diary. And if you examine it closely, we see that he had access to beef, poultry, eggs, apples, peaches, corn, and other grains. So any of these things could have been possible, but it does not appear as if he was regularly sharing them with the enslaved people. As early as 1792, Francis Beeson describes the fact that the enslaved people owned by the Jesuits in many cases had access to their own small plots of land, provision grounds. And so Beeson tells us that the dimensions of these plots in the future shall be 100 yards long, 40 yards wide from the fence to field to which it adjoins. If an enslaved person be married and his wife live on the plantation, he shall be allowed a patch of 200 yards in length and 40 yards in breadth from the fence to the adjoining field. If a married man has a patch of these last dimensions, his wife shall have no separate patch. No boy nor girl shall be entitled to a patch till he or she is a full hand with respect to work. The patches shall be made only in such places as the master shall appoint. If anyone transgresses these rules, he shall, without fail, lose his patch and title to any future. So Beeston is telling us that in 1792. We hear similar kinds of things, though not quite as definite from Moberly much later. But the idea that folks could raise cabbage, cotton, sweet potatoes, and those sorts of things on their own to supplement the rations that were provided by the Jesuits. The other thing we have to grapple with, of course, is that health and sickness are a major issue. And the situation in Southern Maryland is not so different than they might be in other places. In 1790 at Bohemia, we see Dr. Jones visiting an enslaved man to take an abnormal growth off of his forehead. We think that, it's hard to tell whether that was effective. Probably not, because in 1796, that enslaved man, Stephen, had died of cancer. So what we see is that when things can't be treated effectively with home remedies, the Jesuits do turn to the doctors of the age, which are certainly, there's not a lot of professionalization in medicine until the end of the 19th century. And certainly enslaved people themselves had their own set of traditions and healing traditions that they would turn to before something arose to the attention of a farm manager. Moberly also has a lot to tell us about what happens in an everyday way as far as health and sickness on the farms. And he's reporting back over several years that about 9 deaths out of roughly 55 people in the course of 6 years. 3 of 5 white people in Moberly's account died of consumption. So those are folks who are either indentured servants or laborers or folks working on the farm. 1 died of typhoid, and finally 1 died of old age. Of the enslaved people, he tells us, Sucky and Matthew died of old age. With Moberly speculating, I think unlikely, but that they were close to 100 years old. Another enslaved man named Billy died after long suffering with a fistula in ano. A young woman named Sucky, a different young woman named Sucky, suffered from fits, so epileptic seizures, and fell into a fire. Betsy, the blacksmith's wife, perished in childbirth. All of these kinds of things are sort of regular occurrences across the life of the enslaved. Moberly was adamant that when people were sick, they got medical attention. This, again, the question is whether or not he's trying to improve his picture of himself in the world. But we do have other record books in which we show regular doctor's visits. In St. Thomas Manor and then St. Indigo's, we have lists and lists and lists of transactions where the doctors are coming to see enslaved people. At St. Thomas in 1821 and 1822, and then later in St. Indigo's in 1834 and 1836. There's a lot more. But what we do see is that there are a range of common remedies that they're bringing and applying. I wouldn't expect any of us to recognize any of them, but they're sort of our sense of the medicine of the day. But of course, there's an ongoing problem with infectious disease. And we hear over and over and over again in the 18th and the 19th century that we have a situation where people are struggling with malaria. So Francis Neal is saying, Ignatius Brooks is saying in 1806 that he's got 6 people who are infected with malaria, and that everything they're doing is trying to comfort them and those sorts of things. Malaria, as you know, is mosquito-borne, and it's a blood infection, and it ruptures red blood cells as part of the inflammatory response, and it's endemic in Maryland in this period. And Moberly, again, is telling us it's the most prevalent sickness, and suggests that sometimes it lasts for several days, and that other times it can be very, very, very severe. And his judgment about what that may be, the difference in severity might be about the strains of the local parasites, but it also may be simply that the enslaved people had been exposed enough that they had started to have a better and more robust immune response. But malaria is not the main, it's the most frequent problem, but there are also outbreaks of typhoid. And typhoid is deadly. Typhoid is deadly, and typhoid came to St. Thomas in 1826. It can be spread by body lice or fleas and things like that. But once an infected person has typhoid, experience sudden chills, severe headaches, bodily pains, and then fever, coughs and cramping and all sorts of things. Cramped and filthy living conditions contribute to the spread. And so here we see Francis Neal coming back from a visit to Cobb Neck, and he says, on my return, I found that our family here had met with severe chastisement. A young married woman had died. 5 men were confined with sickness, as also 6 women and 5 children. That's a lot of people to have typhoid at once. To 2 of these women, I gave the holy oils last night. Their exit from this world daily expected. Our quarters are condemned and must be destroyed by fire in the beginning of spring to stop the spread, we're assuming. The prospects are dreadful, and I'm obliged to have recourse to ordinary means, carry on business. He's obviously mostly just concerned with continuing the work of the farm. But we're seeing, this situation in which was deadly for the inhabitants of St. Thomas. And then finally we get, in the 1790s, to George and Flora with a different kind of infectious disease. They lived at Newtown, and together they brought 7 children into the world between 1783 and 1795. 5 boys and 2 girls. 1790, however, is a dark year for the family. On February 3rd, their 4-year-old son William dies. Then on February 14th, their 7-year-old son Gabe dies. Finally, on June 20th, their son Francis, just 10 months old, died. This devastating loss was then followed in 1793 by the death of the 2-year-old daughter Mary. Can't be totally certain what the cause of death of these children is, but given the timing, there's a distinct possibility that it was an outbreak of smallpox. And while there was little to be done for typhoid, with smallpox, the Jesuits eventually turned to inoculation to protect their enslaved property. Prior to the adoption of Edward Jenner's method of vaccination, which we all know about, with the cowpox virus around 1800, the available measure to prevent the spread of smallpox was inoculation, a procedure that was risky and only sometimes partially successful. Inoculation was a practice imported from African and Asian cultures during the 17th and 18th century. And the process involved cutting a small slit in the arm of the patient and then infecting that wound with the live smallpox virus, a scab from an infected person. Though the resultant case of the disease should have been mild, the patient would need to be isolated for some time to prevent a larger outbreak. Once a person had suffered the smallpox infection, they couldn't theoretically get it again. So each patient that underwent inoculation took the chance that they would develop a significant case of the virus, of course, and then the rest of the community might be infected, inadvertently exposed. So the Jesuits would have been familiar with inoculation for a variety of reasons, including the fact that in 1777, Georgetown served as an inoculation site for the Continental Army. So when faced with an outbreak, with periodic outbreaks, they did inoculate their population. In 1791, Robert Molyneux took steps to protect the enslaved population at Bohemia. He had 20 individuals inoculated by Dr. William Matthews. And then to prevent the spread of the infection, he sent half the inoculated group to Warwick and the remainder of the group to St. Inigo's to isolate them. So Molyneux's actions at Bohemia took place in the range of smallpox outbreaks that were recorded across the region. In 1792, there were major outbreaks in Norfolk and Hampton, Virginia, and then in 1793, there was one in Richmond. And each of these cases resulted in community-wide inoculation campaigns. So these kinds of things, a thorough reading of these sources, help us reveal a lot about the conditions and the experience of the enslaved in Maryland, the conditions of everyday life. There's still a ton of work to be done here, and I'm moving through this very slowly, but I'm pleased to be able to share it with you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have if I can. It's all a process.
Oh, thank you ever so much. And we do have one question. Karen Harper Royal has raised her hand.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very, very informative. You mentioned that the Jesuits owned enslaved people from 1717 to 1838. Do you know if there's any other research, or have you done more research on the people who were not sent to Louisiana in that 1838 sale?
Yeah, there is, and I think we're going to hear some about that from Keith in a minute. I have been doing my best to trace those folks out, but I have been, because I'm still in the midst of processing the information from the course set of sources in the Maryland province materials, I have not yet embarked on the effort to trace out where those folks ended up. I think Adam has told us that information is spotty at best, but the work continues. I wish I had a better answer to that. I apologize.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And Patricia Bayon Johnson has raised her hand. Yes, Patricia, you appear to be muted.
Thank you for your presentation. I really learned a lot. I just have a comment. I don't have a question. I keep calling Brother Moberly father. I'm used to saying father, not brother, okay? I did that a lot yesterday. You know, I copied the original JPP documents that were online.
Mhm.
I think 2006, which have been
I think that's about when they disappeared. Yeah.
Well, actually, I think they've disappeared maybe after 2007, because I also copied Brother Moberly's diaries. And the date I have on that is January 15th, 2007.
Okay.
Yeah, because you know how they do put the dates on these things.
Yeah.
So just my comment was just that Brother Moberly, I was getting ready to do it again, really seemed to care more about the dog he brought with him. I think it was 18, whatever it was. You know, in this diary, Brother Moberly's diaries, 4 pages of it is dedicated to the exploits of the dog Rockwood.
Yep.
So I just want to make that comment.
Yeah. I mean, I think Moberly's a really, really interesting case, and because he gets fired, part of the reason he gets fired is that when Father Kenny comes to do his inspection and visitation in 1820, we find out that the enslaved people at St. Inigo's complain vociferously about Brother Moberly and his management and his attention and those sorts of things. And so he is, you know, he gets fired. And my reading of him and of those diaries, which most of which are drafted after his dismissal as manager from St. Inigo's, is he is not writing them as, you know, a secret diary as you would write for yourself, right? Is that he is trying to rehab his reputation for future readers and to kind of rebuild his ego. And so I always ask everything that I hear from Moberly about his what he's thinking about, what when he's relaying his experiences as the manager of that farm and how he worked with the enslaved people. I always take it with a grain of salt that he is trying to shine a little more favorable light on his own work and his own industriousness than I think anyone would have found on the ground during those actual years. So I have come over the years not really to trust Moberly very much in his own characterizations of those sorts of things. And I agree, you know, he's very concerned about that dog and also looking smart and looking like like the devout Catholic that he was, feeling that and this is true in Maryland, that there's, you know, that there's a lot of religious competition and angst going on, and he's spending a lot of time defending himself.
Oh, thank you. I too am not impressed with Brother Moberly.
Yes, he's a great source of information. We just have to cross-verify and do our research about conditions in the area, and the earlier letters about what he's actually doing when he's reporting on his actions in time, I think are a little bit more trustworthy than the journals.
Just want to show my face. Here I am.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Great, thank you ever so much. We have another question from Delbert Brown, and beware, we are down to our last 9 minutes for this session. Delbert?
I just had a couple of questions. One was on the website. I tripped over the website by Googling and absolutely love the work you've done with documenting all of the slaves, especially those who were not a part of the sale. And those are my questions for the 1790 and anything before, because my family, I'm tied, but those of us trying to figure it out, we can't go by the sale. We have to go by the ancestors. So this is amazing work to be able to have that, to try to traverse backwards. But with that, I found there are some broken links on the site, and I had no way of being able to say, hey, I found something just to alert you. Like yes. The links are broken. And then the other, so one was, how do we inform you that there is some information that we can share to help you?
Absolutely. I'll put my email in the chat, and I'd be pleased to hear from you directly.
Perfect. The third thing was slaves living abroad. So like so I'm looking at your site, I'm like, is this saying that the spouse is abroad? It would be so helpful to understand where or who the owner is.
What I mean by,
Yeah.
Yeah. So usually what I mean by it, that whole characteristic of people who are located abroad, I mean that they are living in places that are not owned and managed by the Jesuits. So they may be owned by some neighbor, or they may be free people, or those sorts of things. The problem, sort of the problem with assigning a location to an individual is that for many people, that location changes over time. And so depending on which year, somebody might be, they're sending people back and forth between St. Inigo's and St. Thomas and those sorts of things. But the generalized abroad, I imagine, is probably not terribly helpful to those of you who are trying to do genealogical research.
Yeah, I thought it's like, is she saying the spouse is overseas and somehow they're going?
No. Just so I should define, define that in the collection. All I mean is that they are not at a spot that is owned by the Jesuits or the once and former Jesuits,
Or
depending.
you do have a category non-Jesuit, or even to be able to say something that they're owned by a non-Jesuit, then that just helps us to know we have to find the source of their spouse. But okay,
Yes.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. That's it. And your email will be great.
Yes, let me do that while we're.
Yes, and we do have another question from Elliot Brown.
Hi, Sharon. Thanks for your information. I have a quick question for you. In your research, have you come across any evidence of any revolts or rebellions on any of the Jesuit plantations?
No. I mean, what we do see is that there are things that happen in surrounding areas, that is part of the larger literature about enslavement in Maryland, but I don't have any evidence directly of organized rebellion. What I would say, what we know about all sorts of things, is that there's likely to have been the kinds of subtle sabotage along the way, of tools and things and work slowdowns and a variety of things. There, in a number of places, there are notations about the ways in which enslaved people are doing things that the Jesuits find unsavory, as far as alcohol and entertainment and things like that. And so we think that that there's much that is not documented, that I would suggest that little events of everyday rebellion are actually probably much more common than will ever be able to document from the archival record.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
Right. Are there any additional questions? I am checking the chat to see if there's anything that hasn't been addressed. I see that Mary Beth has an interesting comment/question. I'll just read it to you. I am surprised to hear that Port Tobacco as a plantation, or I guess that was supposed to say was a plantation. My great-great-great-grandmother, a Henrietta James, 1785 through 1852, who was said to come from Port Tobacco. We have found her freedom records and Richard Dornall's will, which seem to indicate the wealthy white plantation owner was her father. But her mother remains a mystery. Since Henrietta James, since Henrietta retains the James surname, presumably from her mother, I am wondering whether you have found any affiliation with the surname James from a Port Tobacco plantation or another plantation in the Port Tobacco community where the mother could have been enslaved.
Yeah.
We do not know the given name of Henrietta's mother.
So this is a fascinating question, and I will say that I'm certain I don't have any information on that front, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I do think that in part, what we may see the Jesuits referring to Port Tobacco as a plantation is a plot of land adjacent to Darnell's Port Tobacco. And so there are a set of, in and around St. Thomas Manor, there are a set of individual plots that are held and then sold and recombined, and so the footprint of that space around St. Thomas changes over time. And so at some point, there are folks at a place called Port Tobacco. It is unclear to me whether that is the same, is directly adjacent to the Port Tobacco to which you refer, but is in that community. I don't have, as far as I know, any listing of James. But when we get to the point of 1,400 people, may have slipped my mind, certainly, and I'll go look.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right. Are there any additional questions? All right. We have 2 minutes until we reach our break point. So if there are any last minute questions, ask them now or forever hold your peace.
Or just email me, which is fine. The other thing I will say about this site, emphasize again that it's likely to continue to change slowly. The problem that I pointed to earlier, that disambiguating and recombining people across notations is painstaking business. So I hope it is useful, but I will say that there's a line on every page that says this data is always in motion. The work continues.
We completely understand and totally appreciate. Thank you ever so much, Dr. Leon. It has been a great pleasure hearing all that you have to share.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. And certainly, again, if there's anything I can do, don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Absolutely. Thank you again. We will now go on a 15-minute break. I'm sorry, 5-minute break. Watch it. 5 minutes, and we will return to hear from Mr. Kevin Porter. All right. Thanks so much. All right. It is now 1:15, and we are returning to our slate of speakers for the day. And our final speaker is Mr. Kevin Porter, who will share with us.
For joining us. Delighted to be with you. Today, I want to talk about beyond the 1838 sale. As those of you who know me know that I'm a man of, I'm going to jump right into it, share my screen. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All right. So, beyond the 1838 sale, searching for the last man enslaved at White Marsh, a Jesuit plantation in Prince George's County, Maryland. In March 2021, I posted a tweet that read, "Beyond the 1838 sale, Jesuit slave holding in Maryland did not end in 1838. As I looked through the 1850 census records, the slave schedules, I noticed that there were still enslaved people on Jesuit-owned plantations. One stuck out to me, which was at the Jesuit-owned White Marsh Plantation, Prince George's County. There's an 8-year-old boy who was obviously born after the 1838 sale. And I've been wondering who was this? The tweet was not just a statement, also, it was a call to action, a call to not only reckon with this painful history, but to ensure that none of the men, women, or children that were affected by this history were left behind, especially this 8-year-old boy. The 1838 sale is widely recognized as one of the most harrowing events in the history of Jesuit slaveholding. And not only disrupted the lives of over 300 individuals who were sold, but it tore apart entire communities. Many had parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and close loved ones, free and enslaved, that lived on neighboring plantations. We must also keep in mind that the 1838 sale was not an isolated event. It wasn't the first sale, and it surely wasn't the last sale. So today, without further ado, I'd like to share the story of how one family in particular, among many, endured and resisted Jesuit enslavement long before the sale. And also my quest to identify the last man enslaved at a Jesuit plantation called White Marsh. My mouse is a little sticky. By 1765, the Maryland Jesuits, formally recognized as the Maryland Mission of the Society of Jesus, managed 8 missions throughout the Chesapeake. Each mission played a vital role in sustaining their missionary work, generating revenue through the cultivation of tobacco and other cash crops. Like many planters of that era, the Jesuits relied heavily on the labor of their enslaved people to maintain and expand their operations. Their work in Maryland began in March 1634 when Father Andrew White, the first Jesuit superior of the Maryland mission, arrived from Maryland aboard the Ark and Dove. The voyage was commissioned by Cecil Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore and founder of the Maryland colony, who desired to establish a Catholic sanctuary for his English-speaking brethren in the New World. On the right of the image, to the left is Lord Baltimore, and the image on the right is Father White offering Thanksgiving as he disembarks from the Ark and Dove at St. Clement's Island in St. Mary's County. Father White's first Jesuit mission in Maryland, established in 1634, was St. Indigo's Manor, located in St. Mary's County along the Potomac River. In 1640, they expanded their efforts with the founding of Newtown Manor, situated in Brighton's Bay, not far from their first European settlement. Further north along the Potomac, the St. Thomas Manor Mission was established in 1662 in Charles County near Port Tobacco. Even further north in the upper Patuxent region, the White Marsh Mission was established in 1729, encompassing land on both Anne Arundel and Prince George's counties. To the north was also the Deer Creek Mission, located in Harford County, which was another key site for the northernmost region in Maryland. On the eastern shore, the Bohemian Manor mission was founded in 1704 in Cecil County, while further south on the eastern shore in 1765, the St. Joseph's Mission was established in Talbot County. The Frederick Mission served the western region of Maryland, which is not often discussed, and have also included Georgetown. Although Georgetown wasn't officially a Jesuit mission, many slaves were held there in bondage. So I'd like to take a deep dive into the history of each plantation. For the sake of time today, I want to focus specifically on the White Marsh Mission. For those familiar with White Marsh, situated in Prince George's County in Bowie, Maryland, when you think of White Marsh, the estate today, you might picture the historic chapel perched on the hill off of Route 450 in Bowie, if you're familiar with the area. You may also be familiar with the recent news stories about the burial grounds that were recently uncovered, which revealed over 400 potential unmarked graves of the former enslaved and their descendants. Historically, White Marsh is widely known as the cradle of the American Catholic Church. In 1783, a select body of Catholic clergymen elected the first Archbishop, John Carroll, and adopted a plan of organization for the Roman Catholic Church in what was then the original 13 colonies. The history of the people that lived and labored there actually goes back nearly a century earlier. More than 400 enslaved men, women, and children were forced to work under brutal conditions. They suffered inhumane living conditions and endured poor diets. At the height of its operation, the White Marsh Mission included three major farms, tobacco farms. There's, of course, the what we know as the White Marsh Farm, which was the main farm. There was to the east in Anne Arundel County, the Ino Brightseat Farm. And further south was the oldest settlement, Fingal, which was once the homestead of James Carroll, a wealthy merchant planter of the prominent Carroll family of Maryland. In 1704, James Carroll purchased and patented 402 acres of land in southern Anne Arundel County near the South River, in what was then the South River 100. In 1709, he acquired the Ano plantation further north in Anne Arundel. And then in 1715, he acquired the adjoining property and combined it to establish his Ano Bright Seat complex. Those familiar with the area, much of that land makes up what is today the Crofton Triangle. In 1719, James Carroll acquired land in Prince George's County. The name of the land was, the tract of land was called Lower Granary. It's actually the land where the chapel currently sits. Then in 1722, Charles Calvert of Lord Baltimore's family granted James Carroll all those lands surrounding that property, which made up over 2,000 acres. Before his death in 1729, James Carroll bequeathed these estates to the Society of Jesus, including the enslaved population that lived and labored on them. One of the largest families enslaved by James Carroll's estates were the descendants of Mary Queen, affectionately called Queen Mary by her children, grandchildren, and those that truly loved her. Mary Queen was an indentured servant whose contract had long expired before James Carroll's death. He betrayed Mary Queen. In his last will and testament, he willed her and her family and separated her children and gifted them to the Jesuits. As a result, her descendants endured generations of illegal enslavement. James Carroll was a merchant, planter, and slave trader of Irish descent who had immigrated to Maryland around 1795. And let me just point out, these images are generated by AI. And I didn't just put James Carroll in a green suit because he was Irish. In his inventory and in his day book, it indicates that he bought a silk green suit. So James Carroll was also the nephew of Charles Carroll the Settler, the first Attorney General appointed by Lord Baltimore in 1688. He was also the godfather of the settler's son and his beloved first cousin, James Carroll of Annapolis, who was the father of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the last living signer of the Declaration of Independence. Shortly after Charles Carroll the Settler was appointed as the Baltimore appointed him as the Attorney General, the Glorious Revolution ensued in England and made its way to the shores of Maryland, where the Protestant regime basically tried to uproot Catholicism in Maryland and in the colonies. They prohibited lawyers like the Carroll family from holding political positions, but they were able to take on positions like the land office and the provincial office, land office. So James Curl was eventually appointed the deputy surveyor of the Western Shore of Maryland and master of rent rolls. And in these positions, he acquired land for the Calvert family, for Lord Baltimore, and for his own family. And they amassed thousands of acres throughout Maryland. They also bought and sold slaves to provide labor on those plantations, which is evidenced by James Curl's daybook, which is to the right. So I want to just go through just a few of the families of who were originally enslaved by James Curl, and kind of show some of the complexities of the relationships early on, even before he bequeathed his slave population to the Jesuits. There was the family of Dick and Maria. James Curl purchased Dick from a planter named Thomas Lithicum of Lithicum Walks, which actually adjoined his Anno Brightseed plantation. Dick married James Curl's enslaved woman, Maria, and they had several children. Here was represented as 4 generations of Dick and Maria's family through their eldest daughter, Nellie. Also, just want to point out, so if you can read to the right, Jack and his brother Tomboy were purchased by James Curl from Colonel Henry Darnall, who was the Chancellor of Maryland before the Glorious Revolution. So the children of Jack were the first cousins of Mary Queen's eldest daughter, Nanny Cooper, whose father was Tomboy. So the complexities and the relationships began really early. There was also the Jerry and Nanny family. In 1717, James Curl commissioned a slaving expedition on a ship called the Margaret. The objective was to take captive Africans from Bunce Island and near what is today Sierra Leone, ship them to the Chesapeake, and sell them to local planters in Maryland. James Curl kept for himself 2 of the enslaved people who disembarked from the Margaret. It was a Negro boy and a girl named Nanny. Nanny's eldest daughter, Frances, called Frank, married Tom Queen, who was Mary Queen's firstborn grandson. They lived at the lower quarters of White Marsh until they were their lives were disrupted and eventually sent to the St. Joseph's Mission on the Eastern Shore in Talbot County. Sorry. Then, of course, there was the descendants of Mary Queen. Mary Queen was born free in South America. In 1709, she was taken hostage in Guayaquil, in what today is Ecuador, by the infamous Captain Woodes Rogers during his expedition to the South Seas during the War of the Spanish Succession. She was taken to England, where she lived for 3 years as a free woman before being transported to Maryland by Captain Thomas Larkin and his associate, Edward Phillips. If you can look to the left, you see Mary highlighted in James Curl's daybook, which shows the transaction that he bought her contract. However, James Carroll didn't honor her contract, which would have been 7 years. In his last will and testament, he willed Mary Queen to his nephew, Anthony Carroll. And as a result, she was passed down throughout the Carroll family until she was eventually sold to the Jesuits of the Bohemian Manor Plantation in Cecil County on the Eastern Shore. Mary had three children who would survive through adulthood. It was Nan Queen, who was called by her enslavers Nanny Cooper, but I doubt if she considered herself Nanny Cooper. There's also Phyllis Queen and her youngest son, Ralph, who eventually joined his mother at the Bohemia plantation, and actually was with her when she died in February 1759. Nanny and Phyllis, however, remained at the Fingal plantation in southern Anne Arundel County. When their children reached the age of between 8 and 12, they were then sent over to the main farm, which was officially called Carrollsburg in White Marsh, where they were sent to labor. Over time, White Marsh was handed down through various Jesuits who were assigned to the post to perform their missionary work. By 1774, White Marsh was managed by the infamous John Ashton. John Ashton was the grandnephew of James Carroll through his mother, Mary Carroll. He was also first cousin once removed of Charles Carroll of Annapolis. Actually, Charles Carroll was responsible for bringing him over to Maryland, paid for his transport from Ireland. So thank you, Charles Carroll, for that. Ashton brought mayhem not only to the enslaved community, but to nearly every person that he encountered. In fact, Charles Carroll had actually, he first worked at Charles Carroll's plantation, Doregan, in what is today Howard County. And behind his back went through the superior at the time, John Lewis, and had him sent, well, he was supposed to be originally sent to Port Tobacco, but then ended up at White Marsh, where he wreaked havoc. Ashton made several attempts to sell Phyllis Queen, most likely to avoid her piercing gaze as Ashton preyed on her daughters and granddaughters. He was unsuccessful in selling her. However, her family endured and suffered many abuses under Ashton. Ashton did sell off her younger daughter, Winifred Queen, to Solomon Sparrow. Solomon Sparrow was the son-in-law of her husband's enslaver, Edward Lee. There was resistance on October 15th, 1791. Phyllis's son, Ned, Edward Queen, filed a petition against John Ashton. On the basis that his grandmother, commonly called Queen Mary, arrived in the colony as a free woman. Edward Queen was successful in his lawsuit. Soon after that, his mother and her children, as well as some of his other relatives, his Aunt Nanny's children, also petitioned. Most of Phyllis's children recovered their freedom. If they could claim, and their descendants, they can claim maternal descent and trace back to Mary Queen through their maternal lines. They would, be born free based on that, on their heritage through their maternal line. However, Proteus gained his freedom, but he married an enslaved woman named Anna at White Marsh. And given the laws of Maryland, his children were born into slavery. Proteus was sent to, the Jesuits sent his wife and children to St. Louis in 1829. Before he was sent away, Proteus was able to secure a plot of land in Anne Arundel County from the Hopkins family, where his sister Mary and her children had lived. And you can see a lot of the names between his sister Mary are repeated, or a lot of names shared in common. And that's repeated throughout generations of the Queen family. Here is the lease agreement, and you can see Proteus's signature there, marked by an X. Proteus's aunt Nan Queen, known as Nanny Cooper, unfortunately died before she had the opportunity of recovering her freedom. A few of her children petitioned for freedom as well, but many of them were either sent off or sold before the freedom suits ensued. Her oldest son, Tom Queen, born on June the 2nd, 1735 at White Marsh, was forced to the St. Joseph's Mission in Talbot County. As I indicated earlier, he married the daughter of Nanny, who was often confused with Nanny Cooper. However, they're not identical. They're two individuals. One is the daughter of Mary Queen. The other arrived in the Margaret in 1718. Tom and Frank's children, however, both had had two grandmothers named Nanny. So Nan's daughter Mary and her daughters were eventually sent to St. Thomas Manor in Port Tobacco. Mary was either sold off or died before the freedom suits, but her eldest daughter, Nancy, sued the Reverend Charles Sewell, who was the manager at the time of St. Thomas Manor. Mary's younger daughter, Priscilla, sued the Reverend sued the Reverend Francis Neal in 1810. Also, Mai McQueen, Hester, and Alexis, who we believe may have been her children, were sold off and from Port Tobacco and sent to Georgetown. Priscilla remained at Georgetown. However, her assumed children were sold off. That case went to the Supreme Court where they were represented by Francis Scott Key, and unfortunately they lost the case. And as a result, their children remained enslaved. There was also Nan's son, David Queen. David was born on March the 2nd, 1743 at White Marsh. David was forced to the Deer Creek Mission in Harford County around 1760. The Jesuit records indicate that David periodically was sent back to White Marsh. He was also sent to other Jesuit missions. He joined his brother Tom for a few months at St. Joseph's. He was eventually joined by his younger sister Henny and her daughter Nan, his niece. Then in 1794, David and his niece sued the Reverend Sylvester Borman. That case went on up until 1801, when they eventually recovered their freedom. I should also add that that during that trial was the first time that the name Papa Queen was read out loud, and the deposition was taken before that, but it wasn't read in the prior freedom suits. And this is the deposition of Benjamin Duvall, who was also my great granduncle several times removed, but we'll talk about that later. According to this medical record taken by Dr. John Archer, David remained in Harford County after recovering his freedom. And despite what this record says, Negro David, freed by Reverend Sylvester Mormon, David fought for his freedom. Then there was Mary Queen's grandson, Simon Queen, who was one of the most visible out of all the queens. Simon, like his older brother Tom and his first cousin Proteus, married a woman enslaved at White Marsh, and they had several children. Simon also had other lawsuits beyond the freedom suits. He was also publicized in multiple runaway ads over time. And his sons literally followed his footsteps when they couldn't recover their own freedom. They took matters into their own hand and self-liberated themselves. So today I just want to kind of focus on a man named Moses, who we believe is the son of Simon Queen and his enslaved wife. Moses Queen was born about 1717 in White Marsh. He married an enslaved woman in White Marsh named Nancy. In 1823, Moses was among the first group to be sent to St. Louis with his cousin Isaac, who was the son of Proteus, and Isaac's wife, Susanna, as well as Thomas Brown and his wife, Molly. In 1829, Moses and the rest of the group were eventually joined by Proteus and his family, as well as Jack's Queen and Sally Harrison, who was the daughter of Sally Harrison, who remained at White Marsh. Moses Queen's is a brief bio sketch written in this work to the left, titled "The Jesuits of Middle United States," written by Gilbert Garrahan, published in 1938. According to this work, Moses left behind several children at White Marsh. At least two we've been able to identify through name through baptismal records. That was Charles Queen and his sister Maria. There's also the possibility that Moses and Nancy had other children left behind at White Marsh. There was Delia, who's been identified in the baptismal records as Delia Queen. She was born about 1816 at White Marsh. She married James Hawkins, who was the son of Isaac Hawkins Sr. After the 1838 sale, they were sent to Terrebonne Parish. And there's a reason I believe that Delia may be the daughter of Moses and Nancy. Her descendants share very close matches with the descendants of Charles Queen, multiple descendants of those that remain behind at White Marsh, and also descendant groups in St. Louis. There's also the possibility that a man named Regis Queen may have been the son of Moses and Nancy. Regis was born about 1810 at White Marsh. He married Martha Patsy Mahoney, the daughter of Patrick Mahoney, who was formerly enslaved at White Marsh. Patrick's wife, Belinda, was enslaved by Margaret Hall Wooten, who was the daughter of Francis Magruder Hall. And I just want to take a moment to just kind of highlight something. So John Francis Queen, their son, who was baptized in April of 1831, John is a descendant of Jesuit enslavement, not an ancestor. So he wasn't born enslaved by the Jesuits, but through both lines of his family, his ancestors were enslaved. So on the 1838 census, there is a Regis listed who's been scratched out, possibly because he was so-called married off to Patsy. I've been looking through records to see if through the Wooten plantation, see if he eventually ended up there, but there, further research is needed. Then there was Maria Queen, born about 1812 at White Marsh. There's a Maria listed on the 1838 census. However, I believe that Maria is Maria Herbert, who married Maria Queen, who married Willis Herbert, a man enslaved by Henry Jackson. This baptismal record shows their firstborn child named Moses Herbert, born on August 14th, 1831, possibly named after Maria's father, Moses Queen. And further research is being done to determine if to identify living descendants and determine if those if there's a connection there. Maria was stood as the godparent to John Addison, who was the son of Ellen, daughter of Sally, both enslaved at White Marsh. On this record, she's identified as the daughter of Moses. That same year, in 1822, the Reverend Charles Van Quickenborn baptized Moses' granddaughter, Peggy, the daughter of Sally and Harris. I'm sorry, Sarah Lee and Charles, who's identified here as the son of Nancy. The very next year, the same man who baptized Moses Queen's granddaughter, Charles Van Quickenborn, forced Nancy and Moses to St. Louis in 1823. In Garanham's work, we see that Moses made several attempts to go back to Maryland to join his children and grandchildren. However, there's no record showing that he ever had a chance to reconnect with his children and grandchildren that remained behind at White Marsh. His son, Charles Queen, was sold in 1838. According to this census record, he ran away, but was eventually captured and sent to Terrebonne Parish and joined his family. They were the first group, his wife and children were the first groups to be sent out from White Marsh. His daughter, Eliza Queen, however, remained behind after the Catherine Jackson and the Yonkers departed to Louisiana. She was sold to Jesse Beatty at his plantation in Terrebonne Parish. However, there are no records showing that she was ever sent to Terrebonne Parish, despite several attempts from Jesse Beatty to have her sent down. Eliza wasn't the only person left behind after the 1838 sale. There was Old Isaac, who we call Old Man Isaac, his son Charles, who reportedly died shortly afterwards, his son Isaac, who ran away. There was Sally Harris, her son Billy Harris, Joseph Blacklock, Kitty and her 3 children, Mary, Sam, and Elizabeth. There was Polly, her daughter Sally Diggs, Sally's children, William, Robert, and Henry. There was Isaiah Queen, who was the son of James and Harriet Queen, and their daughter Nancy that remained behind. Allegedly, Betsy West ran off with James before she was to be shipped off. There was Richard, Marjorie, who married Billy Queen, who recovered his freedom from John Ashton in 1696. Their son, Lynn Queen, remained behind. There was also Minty Queen, her 2 daughters, Nancy and Mary Jarvis, who may have been related to Proteus, or Proteus's twin brother, Jarvis Queen. There was James Queen, who was married to a free woman named Nancy. There's also Eliza Dorsey, who remained behind in Maryland, who was married to Moses Taylor. According to some sources, their children were eventually sent to Louisiana. There was Rita's Queen, Maria, and her 2 children, Marie and William. Isaac's wife isn't listed. She was sent to Baltimore, but eventually goes back to White Marsh after the sale. There was also Isaac's daughter, Millie Hawkins, and her 2 children, Sevilla and Chris who were the children of her and her husband, Vachelle Waters' children. And I'm still researching to see if see where they ended up after the sale, or see if they, to find out who they were sold to. And I believe they were sold to a man named Colonel James Waters, who owned her husband, Vachelle Waters. Maria Queen, who we believe is Maria Herbert, and Marjorie's son, Billy, who was born at White Marsh, but isn't listed on the sale. And we later see him living in White Marsh. By 1850, there are 5 people listed at White Marsh. I believe there's an error in that listing, because there's no indication that Robert Diggs is on that list, but we see him later on at White Marsh. There was an 8-year-old boy born after the sale. He later appears in the 1860 census slave schedule a decade later at the age of 18, owned by Charles Lancaster, who was the Procurator General and the agent for the Corporation of Roman Catholic Clergymen. So the first thing I want to do is do the process of elimination, try to determine who would have been remained behind based on the ages and the census. Matthew Sanders was the manager of White Marsh at the time. Sally Harrison would have been about 80. Marjorie Queen would have been about 75 based on the census record, the 1838 census. Sally Diggs and possibly Eliza Queen. But the mystery was, who was this 8-year-old boy? So I've been pouring through records, trying to determine who this man was. Who was the last man enslaved at White Marsh? And what I've been able to determine is that he was John Queen, born about 1842 at White Marsh, the last child born enslaved at White Marsh. A candidate for his mom is possibly Eliza Queen, who remained behind, who was the daughter of Charles Queen and Sally. Eliza is listed as the as the age of 12 in the 1838 census. On this 1850 slave schedule, there's a woman of the age of 25 who would have been born around the same time, between 1825 and 1826. There's also a possibility that she was the mother of John Queen. So if this hypothesis holds true, John Queen would have been the grandchild of Charles and Sally Queen and the great-grandchild of Moses and Nancy Queen. At the time of his birth, his immediate family would have been divided between 3 states, Missouri, Louisiana, and Prince George's County, Maryland. John Queen eventually married Rachel Parker, who's been identified in some records as Rachel Hawkins. Rachel Parker was enslaved by Christiana Duval, who was the daughter of Marine Duval of Wilson's Plain, which adjoined the southern border of White Marsh. They had a son, possibly born Edward Queen, and born on July the 4th of 1860. The very next year, on April the 17th, 1861, barely able to walk, Christina Duvall sold, quote, an infant, a Negro boy, an infant called Edward Parker, to her cousin, Ann Clark, for $10. So it was common for enslaved individuals to take the name of their mother. So Edward may have been born Edward Queen, but eventually assumed the name Edward Parker. And this actually gets a little personal for me. So if you can see the witness down there, Joshua T. Clark. Joshua T. Clark was with my fifth great grandfather. As I mentioned earlier, Benjamin Duvall, who we get the name, who knew James Queen and Mary Queen, who was an eyewitness to a lot of the events that occurred during Mary Queen's time, was the uncle of both Joshua T. Clark and Christina Duvall. Ann Clark was the daughter-in-law of Joshua T. Clark, and her husband, Joshua T. Clark Jr., would have been my granduncle, several times removed. For over 2 centuries, the Clarks and the Duvalls were neighbors to the enslaved population at White Marsh. Over time, they worked for the Clarks, they worked for the Duvalls, and all of the areas highlighted here are places where the Queen family worked after emancipation, or after recovering their freedom, and subsequently after emancipation. Actually, that Rose Hill plantation is where Proteus and his family lived before being sent to St. Louis. Because if you see near the star, so the star is where the church is now, and you see Miss Duvall, who is Christina Duvall. So Edward Parker would have been born on the Jesuit plantation proper. She sold off the remaining portions that she had, that she inherited from Wilson's Plain, was a Duvall plantation, and then purchased a small plot of land on the White Marsh property. You can see here in this aerial map taken in 1938, where about Christina Duvall would have lived, and possibly where John Queen and his wife, Rachel Parker, lived. It's ironic that the families, the Clark family, who testified on behalf of the Queens and actually helped them secure their freedom based on their testimony about Mary Queen and providing intimate details about their life, end up purchasing a descendant and enslaving the people that they helped to recover their freedom. John Queen wasn't alone at White Marsh. He was joined by Sally Diggs, Robert Diggs, Marjorie, her son Billy, Ellen Queen, his wife, John Griffin, who married Agnes Queen, who is presumed to be the daughter or granddaughter of Billy and Marjorie. There was Stephen Queen and his family, his wife, Monica Gant, Basil Hall, who married Margaret Queen, the daughter of Daniel Queen, who recovered his freedom from John Ashton. His brother, so it's 2 sets of brother and sisters who married each other. Elizabeth was also the daughter of Daniel Queen, and John Queen and his family. So you can see here at the top, Matthew Sanders, who was the owner of John Queen at the time of the census was taken, and some of the free families that were living at White Marsh. If you notice the Waters on the list, I'm trying to research to see whether they are descendants of Millie Hawkins and how they actually recovered their freedom here. At the bottom of the list is my ancestor, Stephen Queen, and his family. Stephen would have known John. He died on, he lived, labored, and died for all of his life on the plantation. He was buried in June the 5th, 1883 in an unmarked grave. Through Stephen Queen, what was passed down to my family, the old tradition was that the Queens were descended from a woman on the Eastern Shore. Like a game of telephone, old histories get diminished over time as they're passed through generations. But that little tidbit was very telling. When I started to do the research, we now know that that woman was on the Eastern Shore was Mary Queen. And I've often wondered what conversations Stephen would have had with his family, and now particularly what knowledge and wisdom he would have shared with John Queen. And I wonder if they talked about the legacy of their ancestor, Mary Queen, who was one of the first of their family enslaved by the Jesuits at White Marsh. I also wonder if John Queen ever reflected on his own legacy, being one of the last enslaved at White Marsh.
All right. Thank you ever so much for that wonderful presentation. We have reached almost the end of our time today, but I do want to leave time for those who have questions to get their questions answered. I see that Rochelle has raised her hand.
Oh, Lord, Kevin. That's first of all. Oh, Lord. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I was curious about a couple of persons you mentioned in your presentation. Eliza. How old was Eliza? Or when was she born?
She was
Eliza
born,
Queen. Huh?
yeah, she was born sometime between 1826 and 1825 and 1826.
The reason why I asked, there was an Eliza Queen that married Austin West, who was Betsy's son. Did you know about her?
Yes.
Okay, and did you eliminate her as being that
Yeah.
Eliza?
I looked at both, and yeah, they aren't one and the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that was one of my questions. The other question I wanted to know was, do you have any information how or why a number of the enslaved people names have Queen Hawkins as their name?
That's an excellent question, and one I've been trying to figure out all my life. I have Hawkins family too. What my hypothesis is that some of the Hawkinses are queens, and that they may have gotten the names from their husbands, from the wife's husband, and didn't take the name Queen. The DNA is just between the Hawkins family at the White Marsh are so intertied that, and also that's why I brought up the like we don't know a lot of the surnames, like Nanny, of the Margaret, Dick and Maria's children, they could have had, that name could have come from them too. Or some of the, their children's spouses.
And who was Isaac? Was that old man's Isaac wife that you
Yes,
what was her name?
we don't know.
Okay.
There is a Nellie listed on the 1833 tax assessment. And we know Isaac's firstborn daughter's name is Nellie. So that's a clue that, we can hypothesize that Nellie that's listed, that's not, and that Nellie isn't accounted for on the 1838 census.
Okay.
But then we see his wife appear in records after the sale. So.
And one more thing, and I promised everybody I'm gonna stop. The Delia, to find out that Delia, James' wife, Hawkins, Delia may be a queen was a new, exciting revelation. So thank you for that. And I'm gonna shut up. Bye, y'all.
All right, thank you. And I see that Jerome Spears has a comment.
Okay, I hope you can hear. Kevin, that was awesome. I'm glad this was recorded so we can go back through this. There's so many nuggets of information that it's going to take more than one pass to absorb everything that was here. I said in the comments earlier that it's going to take all hands on deck, a collaborative effort to make sense of some of this. Look at the movement. Look at the migration. We haven't even talked about some of the enslaved changing their own names as they got away, and some of the misattributed parentage that's out there. There's so many. This isn't checkers. This isn't chess. This is 3D chess. And if we're going to play three-dimensional chess to make sense of this, we've got to put all the tools in the game that we have at our disposal. The people on this call who either directly or indirectly know folks whose DNA could directly map back to some of the people we've talked about today. And in doing so, it could help validate some of these records that we've come in contact with. And we know Ancestry has this 23 million person database. It's great to have the trees and the matches and all that, but without a chromosome browser, we can't see the ancestors talking to us. That's where they've dropped the breadcrumbs in the chromosomes. Some of you have data that can pull that answer out. So if you're in Ancestry and for whatever reason, you have not moved your data to GEDmatch, where advanced researchers can help find these ancestors who are talking to us, please reconsider. Thank you.
Miss Joyce said, this is so informative and just as meticulous as Alex Haley's roots. How long did your research take?
Lifetime. I've got interested. I've always been interested in family history. I was always curious about my grandmother's maiden name, Queen. That had always intrigued me. And in 2009, I visited the Maryland State Archives for my grandmother to locate her grandmother's death certificate. And I soon realized that I found over hundreds of Mary Queens and trying to piece together my ancestor, I ended up connecting hundreds of other families and realized they were all related. At least some of them were related. And then when the story broke in 2016, that tree that I created, people started reaching out to me because I made the connection to White Marsh. That's where my great grandparents were married, but I didn't realize the historic significance of White Marsh until the story broke. So, yeah, it's been a long journey and the work isn't done. Like Jerome said, it's going to take all of us working together and sharing the stories that were passed down to me. That's why I'm telling them now, like my great grandmother passed down to me, and I want to tell the world. So
Wonderful. We see that Karen Harper Royal has raised her hand.
Thank you. Kevin, this was an absolutely excellent presentation. As you know, I have been very interested in your research for years now. But just so that folks don't get confused as they are looking at Queen DNA matches, can you speak a little bit about the other set of queens that come from the McQueen line, just so
absolutely
folks will know that not all of this, all of the queens come from Mary the Papa Queen.
right. And I learned that early on in my research because a lot of people assume that the Queen name came from descendants of Marsham Queen, who was whose ancestor was Samuel McQueen. They aren't related. They do have connections to the Jesuits in Southern Maryland, but they have no connection to White Marsh. The descendants, the queens from White Marsh descend from Mary Queen, known as the Papa Queen. The Marsham family, who was one of the largest white queen families in Southern Maryland, also owned slaves as well. And some of their enslaved population took the name Queen. They aren't, however, descendants of Jesuit enslavement. And where, you know, they do have a lot of rich history, but it's, you know, separate history from the history of Jesuit enslavement and the descendants of Mary Queen. So a lot of people have contacted me, and I've had to, you know, I hate to tell them that, but it's good for you to research your family, not just get caught up on the story, but actually take a deep dive and don't leave your own ancestors out. You know, your ancestors are waiting for you. So
Exactly, yes. And we do see that Deborah Brown has now raised her hand.
So thank you for this extraordinary presentation, as everyone has said. One, I definitely descend, one of my lines is through the McQueens. And the story was, you know, as you shared. But isn't it possible, although it takes more research, some of those changed names of queens could have remarried into the queens? And that's where DNA can help that particular research. But it's definitely going to take more digging and finding those records to be able to assert that.
yeah, it'll take, especially if you know someone, if you have a male, take the Y DNA, autosomal DNA won't help us so much in that aspect, but looking through specific lines, I haven't come across any genetic connections with the McQueen families, at least not on my Queen side. I have connections to the Neal family, the white Neal families in Charles County and St. Mary's County, and I do see connections to that McQueen line through the Neal family, but not through my Queen line. But yeah, it's possible that, you know, they did. Some of the people that were enslaved by the Queen family that who are African Americans may have married into Mary Queen's descendants, but I to date haven't seen any evidence of that.
So one part of that, it could have been through the enslaver, because we have a lot of people who we don't know the parent also. We do have some of them identifying as mulattoes that we still have to figure that part out. So that is also a possible, another connection. Well, my initial question was your understanding of the Anderson and the Proctor surname as a possibility connection to Queen.
I know for Proctor, the Proctor family of Charles County married the descendants of Charles Queen, who his family eventually, who we believe, you know, allegedly is the son of John Ashton and Susanna Queen. They married into the Proctor family, so it is a connection with the Proctor family. With the Andersons, I'm not sure. The Anderson was a popular name in Maryland, so I would have to, trace back to a specific family line and see if there's any connection.
I think I saw someone shared a David and Sally Anderson might have had a daughter or a son that married, who was an Anderson, married a Mary Queen. That's where I think I saw that possible connection. And I'm a DNA match to a person who identified that. So, but of course, still needing to try to flesh that out.
Thank you.
All right, and I see that Rosalind has raised her hand.
Yes, Kevin, I want to thank you for all the research that you put into this. I know it's your family and everything, but I have a match to one of the Queen Memory Project kits, the DM kit. And I haven't really dug into it yet. I've listened to some of the presentations given about it, and it just, the whole GU 272 just seemed a little overwhelming. And with everything else I was doing with my own family, I just decided to kind of wait on it. But I have been going through and just searching for matches. My sister has a match to one of the Butler kits. But I've seen some of those matches in my own too. Her Butler is on her, I think it's on her paternal side. And then her son has two kits, a BH kit and an MB kit, one on his father's side and the other on his mother's side. So, but after seeing your presentation today, I feel a little more confident in going in there and starting to dig in on that particular kit on my maternal side, the DM kit. So thank you so much for all that, and thank all of y'all for this great presentation, and you, Shannon, for putting this together. It's been really good. Thank you, and for everybody on here who's put in the work.
Thank you ever so much. Do we have any additional questions or comments? All right. Well, if not, I can tell you that we have placed the exit survey in the chat for those of you who want to evaluate your experience today. You will also receive a link to the recording of today's event, and we will regroup next week, same place, same time. So once again, thank you ever so much for joining us. Our purpose for having this series is to take this moment in time to get everyone in the Descendant community, broadly defined, to think about the past and how we can use the information, the lessons that our ancestors learned to teach the next generation and make the world a better place, not only for them, but for everyone. So again, we hope that you are able to join us for next week's event and the following week. And again, please feel free to answer the exit survey, and you should expect to get a recording by the end of this week. Then, Karen, you have a question?
Well, I just want to tell you, I just clicked on the exit survey and it says I have to request access. I don't know if you want to change the sharing settings.
Well, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
All right, any additional questions or comments? Okay. All right, but we will get you that link to the exit survey via email. And if you have any additional questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to reach out. We are always happy to hear from you. It has been wonderful. All right. Until next time, enjoy a super Saturday and a wonderful weekend. Thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Shannon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Shannon. Rochelle, too.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
I loved it, Shannon. Thank you so much. It was just so endearing and enlightening and educational.
Oh, I'm so glad you could join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shannon.
The link
Thank
has
you.
been fixed, you guys. I fixed the
Hmm.
link.
Mhm.
So if you want to try it.
Okay.
Thank you, Karen, for bringing it to our attention.
Rochelle, could you send me the link for Shannon, please?
Shannon, what a link. Oh, okay. I'll send it to you.
I
Hold
have a
on.
little problem,
Hold
technical
on, and I want to
difficulties.
make sure it works anyway, so that'll
Okay.
be fine. Hold on a
Thank you.
second for me. Not a problem. Let me find it. Okay. Hold on. Okay, I'm putting it in the chat. There it is. See if it works.
Checking it now. Let's see. Oh, great. Okay.
Hope that's the right
Let's see.
link. Let me see. Hope
I'll
I ain't share the edit link. Hold on 1 minute. Oh, let me see.
training expert. I think it's, I don't know what this is.
Yeah, this the one.
Is
Copy
it?
this.
Is
This
it?
the link. This the link you need. Let me shorten it.
Okay. All right, I'll go back.
There you go.
Oh,
Boom. The one on the bottom.
okay. All right, let's see.
Shannon, you turn the recording off.
Okay, the one on the bottom. Wonder